The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Central Precinct's report writing room, casting long rectangles across the worn wooden desks, where officers had been documenting the city's daily dramas for more than 40 years. Detective Michael Santos settled into his usual chair at desk number 7, the same desk where he had written thousands of reports over the past 2 decades, each one a small act of translation from the messy complexity of human experience into the ordered language of official documentation. The report he was preparing to write concerned an incident that had occurred the previous evening on Maple Street, where Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez had called to report suspicious activity in her neighbor's yard. It was the kind of call that might seem routine to someone unfamiliar with police work, but Detective Santos had learned long ago that no call was truly routine, that each one represented a moment when someone had decided that their normal ability to handle a situation had been exceeded and professional intervention was required. He rolled a fresh sheet of paper into his typewriter, the IBM Selectric that had been assigned to this desk since 1979 and had somehow survived every attempt at modernization. The machine had a particular rhythm to its operation, a satisfying mechanical precision that helped him think through the careful construction of sentences that would need to convey not just the facts of what had happened, but the context that would allow anyone reading the report to understand why those facts mattered. Mrs. Vasquez had called at 11:47 p.m. according to the dispatch log, reporting that she had observed someone moving around in her neighbor's backyard with what appeared to be a flashlight. The neighbor, Mr. James Patterson, was known to be out of town visiting his daughter in Phoenix, a detail that Mrs. Vasquez had mentioned because she kept informal track of the comings and goings in her immediate neighborhood, the way many elderly residents did, as a matter of both curiosity and community safety. Detective Santos began his report with the standard heading information, filling in the case number, date, time, and location with the mechanical precision that had become second nature over his years of report writing. But even these routine details required careful attention, because a case number entered incorrectly could make a file nearly impossible to locate years later, and an imprecise time notation could create problems if the case ever went to court. The body of the report began with Mrs. Vasquez's call, but Detective Santos knew that simply recording her words would not provide sufficient context for understanding the situation. He included details about Mrs. Vasquez herself, noting that she was 73 years old, had lived on Maple Street for 42 years, and was known to local officers as a reliable witness who called police only when she was genuinely concerned about something significant. These details might seem irrelevant to someone focused purely on the immediate facts of the suspicious activity, but Detective Santos understood that police reports served multiple purposes beyond documenting individual incidents. They created a historical record of how communities functioned, who was involved in maintaining neighborhood safety, and how different residents interacted with law enforcement over time. He described Mrs. Vasquez's observation in careful detail, noting that she had been unable to sleep due to the heat and had been sitting by her bedroom window, which faced Mr. Patterson's backyard, when she noticed movement near his garden shed. The figure appeared to be carrying a flashlight and was moving deliberately rather than randomly, suggesting someone who knew the layout of the yard and had a specific purpose for being there. Mrs. Vasquez had watched for approximately 10 minutes before calling police, during which time she had observed the figure enter the shed and emerge carrying what appeared to be tools or equipment. This detail was significant because it suggested that whoever was in the yard was not simply trespassing, but was actively removing items from the property. Detective Santos had responded to the call along with Officer Jennifer Kim, arriving at 12:15 a.m. to find Mrs. Vasquez waiting on her front porch, still in her nightgown but with a sweater pulled over it for modesty. She had pointed toward Mr. Patterson's yard, which appeared empty and undisturbed from their vantage point on the street. But she insisted that she had seen someone there less than half an hour earlier. The report documented their systematic search of Mr. Patterson's property, conducted with Mrs. Vasquez's permission to enter through her yard, and with her assurance that Mr. Patterson would not object to their presence. They had found the garden shed unlocked, with several tools missing from their usual positions on the wall-mounted pegboard where their outlines had been traced in black marker. This detail about the tool outlines was significant because it provided clear evidence that items were indeed missing, and it suggested that Mr. Patterson was the kind of person who organized his possessions carefully enough that absences would be immediately obvious. Detective Santos made note of the specific tools that appeared to be missing: a hedge trimmer, a small chainsaw, and a set of precision pruning shears. The investigation had continued with a canvass of the immediate neighborhood, during which Detective Santos and Officer Kim had spoken with residents on both sides of Maple Street and the adjoining blocks. Most neighbors had been asleep and had heard nothing unusual. But Mr. Robert Chun, who lived 3 houses down from Mr. Patterson, mentioned that he had heard what sounded like a small motor starting up around midnight, though he had assumed it was someone using a generator during the power outage that had affected parts of the neighborhood earlier that evening. This detail about the power outage required additional documentation, including a call to the electric company to confirm the timing and extent of the outage, which had lasted from 10:30 p.m. until 12:45 a.m. and had affected 6 city blocks. The outage was significant because it would have provided cover for someone using power tools in the area, as the normal background noise of air conditioners and televisions would have been absent. Detective Santos documented his attempt to contact Mr. Patterson in Phoenix, reaching him at his daughter's house at 1:30 a.m. Mr. Patterson had confirmed that he had not given anyone permission to borrow his tools and had expressed particular concern about the chainsaw, which he described as expensive and potentially dangerous in the wrong hands. He had provided a detailed description of the missing items and had given permission for a more thorough search of his property. The expanded search had revealed additional evidence of the intruder's presence, including footprints in the soft soil near the shed and what appeared to be tire tracks in the alley behind Mr. Patterson's house. Detective Santos had photographed these impressions using the portable camera equipment that was standard in police vehicles, taking multiple shots from different angles to ensure that the evidence would be properly documented. The footprint evidence was particularly interesting because it suggested someone wearing work boots with a distinctive sole pattern, information that could prove valuable if a suspect was eventually identified. Detective Santos had made careful measurements of the prints and had created detailed sketches showing their location relative to other features of the yard, writing these details into his report. Detective Santos reflected on the importance of thorough documentation in cases like this. While the theft of garden tools might not seem like a major crime, it represented a violation of trust and security that could have significant emotional impact on the victim, particularly an elderly person living alone. Moreover, the specific nature of the stolen items suggested that this might not be a random crime, but part of a pattern that could affect other residents in the area. The report continued with documentation of Detective Santos's efforts to determine whether similar thefts had occurred in other parts of the city. He had contacted the watch commanders for the 3 adjacent precincts, providing descriptions of the stolen items and asking them to check their recent reports for similar incidents. This kind of cross-jurisdictional communication was essential for identifying crime patterns that might not be obvious when cases were considered in isolation. The response from the West Precinct had been immediately relevant. Lieutenant Morrison reported that they had received 3 reports of tool thefts from residential properties over the past 2 weeks, all involving high-quality power tools taken from unlocked sheds or garages. The pattern suggested someone who was either planning to use the tools for specific projects or who had identified a market for reselling this type of equipment. Detective Santos documented his coordination with Detective Alice Rodriguez from the West Precinct, who was investigating the similar cases in her jurisdiction. They had agreed to share information and to coordinate their patrol strategies to increase the likelihood of catching the thief in the act. This collaboration had required careful documentation to ensure that evidence collected by either department could be used effectively if arrests were made. The investigation had taken an interesting turn when Detective Rodriguez called the next morning to report that one of her cases had been solved through an unexpected connection. A local pawn shop owner had contacted police after a customer had attempted to sell several power tools that matched the descriptions from recent theft reports. The customer had been asked to return later in the day. Given police time to set up surveillance, Detective Santos documented his role in the surveillance operation, which had been conducted jointly by officers from both precincts. They had observed 26-year-old Marcus Thompson attempting to sell the stolen tools, including the chainsaw taken from Mr. Patterson's shed. Thompson had been arrested without incident and had eventually confessed to all 4 thefts, explaining that he had needed money to pay rent and had chosen to steal tools because they were valuable and relatively easy to resell. The case resolution had required extensive additional documentation, including detailed inventories of recovered property, coordination with the district attorney's office regarding charges, and follow-up reports to all the victims. Detective Santos had personally returned Mr. Patterson's tools when the elderly man returned from Phoenix, a meeting that had provided closure for both the victim and the investigating officer. This case exemplified the kind of methodical police work that characterized much of Detective Santos's daily routine. While the media often focused on dramatic crimes and high-speed chases, the reality of police work involved mostly careful documentation, patient investigation, and coordination with other officers and agencies. The quality of the paperwork often determined whether cases could be successfully prosecuted and whether patterns of criminal activity could be identified and addressed. Detective Santos moved on to his next report, this one concerning a domestic disturbance call that had required a very different kind of documentation. The incident had occurred at the Rodriguez household on Pine Street, where neighbors had called police after hearing loud arguments and what sounded like furniture being thrown. These kinds of calls were among the most challenging for officers to document, because they often involved complex family dynamics that were difficult to capture in the structured format of police reports. Officer Sarah Martinez had been the first to respond, arriving to find Carlos Rodriguez, age 34, and his wife Maria, age 31, in the middle of a heated argument about finances and child care responsibilities. Their 2 children, ages 6 and 9, had been sent to their rooms, but were clearly upset by the conflict between their parents. The report required careful attention to the legal requirements for documenting domestic disturbances, including specific observations about any signs of physical violence, the emotional state of all parties involved, and the immediate safety concerns that had prompted the police response. Officer Martinez had noted that while the argument was loud and emotionally intense, there were no visible signs of physical violence, and both parties appeared to be primarily frustrated rather than angry. The documentation continued with detailed accounts of separate interviews conducted with each spouse, a standard procedure designed to allow both parties to express their concerns without the immediate pressure of confrontation. Carlos Rodriguez had explained that he had been laid off from his construction job 3 weeks earlier and was feeling overwhelmed by the financial pressure of supporting his family. While looking for new employment, Maria Rodriguez had described her frustration with managing the household and caring for their children while also working part-time as a home health aide. She felt that Carlos was not taking sufficient responsibility for job hunting and was spending too much time watching television and drinking beer instead of actively seeking employment. Officer Martinez's report included careful documentation of her observations about the family's living situation, noting that the house was clean and well maintained, that the children appeared healthy and cared for, and that there were no obvious signs of ongoing domestic violence. These details were important because they provided context for understanding the argument as a situational crisis rather than a pattern of abusive behavior. Resolution of this call had required what Officer Martinez described as crisis intervention rather than traditional law enforcement. She had worked with both parents to develop strategies for managing their immediate stress while addressing the underlying financial pressures that were creating tension in their relationship. This had included providing information about employment assistance programs, financial counseling services, and emergency assistance for families in crisis that the report documented. Officer Martinez's follow-up contact with the family over the following weeks, tracking the progress they made in addressing both the immediate crisis and the underlying issues that had created it. Carlos had found temporary work through a day labor service and had eventually secured full-time employment with a different construction company. Maria had been able to reduce her work hours and spend more time with their children, relieving some of the stress that had been building in their household. This kind of follow-up documentation was unusual in police work, but Officer Martinez had recognized that domestic disturbances often reflected deeper social and economic problems that required ongoing attention rather than one-time interventions. Her careful tracking of the family's progress had demonstrated the effectiveness of crisis intervention approaches that addressed underlying causes rather than simply responding to immediate symptoms. Detective Santos found himself thinking about the different types of documentation required for different kinds of police work as he continued writing reports throughout the morning. Each type of case demanded its own approach to organizing information, its own attention to specific legal requirements, and its own consideration of how the documentation might be used by other professionals in the criminal justice system. A burglary report, for example, required detailed inventories of stolen property, precise measurements and sketches of points of entry, and careful documentation of physical evidence that might be used for forensic analysis. The language had to be specific, enough to support insurance claims, and detailed enough to help investigators identify patterns or connections to other cases. Traffic accident reports demanded a completely different kind of precision, with exact measurements of skid marks, detailed diagrams showing the positions of vehicles, and careful documentation of weather and road conditions that might have contributed to the accident. These reports often became crucial evidence in civil lawsuits, requiring a level of technical accuracy that could withstand scrutiny from expert witnesses and opposing attorneys. Missing person reports required yet another approach, focusing on detailed physical descriptions, documentation of the missing person's normal routines and relationships, and careful tracking of all investigative steps taken to locate them. These reports often needed to be updated multiple times as investigations progressed, creating a comprehensive record of law enforcement's efforts that could be crucial for both criminal prosecutions and civil liability issues. Each type of report also served different audiences within the criminal justice system. Patrol officers wrote initial incident reports that would be read by detectives, supervisors, and prosecutors. Detective reports were often read by judges, defense attorneys, and expert witnesses. Follow-up reports might be reviewed by parole officers, social workers, or victim advocates. Understanding these different audiences was crucial for writing reports that would effectively serve their intended purposes. Detective Santos had developed his own system for organizing this information in his reports, beginning with a clear summary of the incident that allowed readers to quickly understand what had happened, followed by detailed chronological documentation of the investigation, and concluding with any follow-up actions that might be required. This structure had evolved over his 20 years of report writing, refined through experience and feedback from prosecutors and supervisors who had used his reports in various legal proceedings. He had also learned the importance of writing in clear, objective language that avoided police jargon and technical terminology that might be confusing to civilian readers. While police officers often communicated with each other using abbreviations and specialized terms, reports needed to be accessible to jurors, judges, and other professionals who might not be familiar with law enforcement terminology. The afternoon brought a different type of documentation challenge in the form of a fraud investigation that had been developing over several weeks. Detective Santos was working with the Financial Crimes Unit to document a complex scheme involving forged checks and identity theft that had affected multiple victims throughout the city. This type of investigation required what Detective Santos thought of as archaeological documentation, carefully reconstructing a series of related incidents that had occurred over an extended period of time. Each fraudulent transaction needed to be documented individually, but the report also needed to show how all the incidents were connected and how they demonstrated a pattern of criminal activity. The case had begun with a simple report from Mrs. Helen Chang, who had discovered that someone had been writing checks on her account for purchases at various retail stores throughout the city. The initial investigation had revealed that Mrs. Chang's purse had been stolen from her car 3 weeks earlier, an incident that she had reported to police, but which had seemed like a simple theft until the fraudulent checks began appearing. Detective Santos's report documented his discovery that the theft of Mrs. Chang's purse was connected to at least 6 other similar incidents, all involving elderly women whose purses had been stolen from their cars while they were shopping. In each case, the thief had gained access to checking account information and had used that information to create fraudulent checks for purchases at stores where identification was not carefully verified. The documentation of this pattern had required extensive coordination with multiple retail establishments, banks, and other law enforcement agencies. Detective Santos had created detailed charts showing the connections between different incidents, timelines showing when various fraudulent transactions had occurred, and maps showing the geographic distribution of the crimes. This type of comprehensive documentation was essential for prosecutors, who would need to demonstrate the scope and organization of the criminal scheme to a jury. It also helped other law enforcement agencies identify similar patterns in their own jurisdictions and coordinate their investigations to prevent additional crimes. The case had eventually led to the arrest of 3 individuals who had been working together to target elderly shoppers and exploit their financial information. The prosecution had relied heavily on Detective Santos's careful documentation to show how the defendants' activities constituted organized criminal enterprise rather than isolated incidents. As evening approached, Detective Santos found himself reflecting on the essential role that careful documentation played in effective law enforcement. While the public often focused on the more dramatic aspects of police work, the reality was that most cases were solved through patient investigation and meticulous attention to detail rather than through dramatic confrontations or technological breakthroughs. The reports he had written that day would become part of the permanent record of the police department's work, available for review by future investigators, researchers, and anyone else who needed to understand how these cases had been handled. Some of these reports would be referenced for years to come, as appeals worked their way through the court system or as similar cases required investigation. He took particular pride in the clarity and completeness of his documentation, knowing that his reports would serve not only their immediate investigative purposes, but also their broader function of creating a historical record of the community's experience with crime and law enforcement. Future officers would be able to learn from the approaches he had taken, the mistakes he had made, and the successes he had achieved. The typewriter at desk number 7 had processed thousands of such reports over its decades of service, each one representing a moment when the complex reality of human behavior had been translated into the structured language of official documentation. Detective Santos cleaned the keys and covered the machine, preparing it for the next officer who would use it to continue the endless process of transforming chaos into order, one carefully constructed sentence at a time. The building around him settled into its evening rhythm, but the work of documentation continued in offices throughout the precinct. Other officers were writing their own reports, creating their own careful records of the day's investigations and interventions. Together, these individual efforts created a comprehensive picture of how the community functioned, how problems were identified and addressed, and how the delicate balance of social order was maintained through the patient application of professional skill and careful attention to detail. In the archives below, thousands of similar reports rested in their filing cabinets, creating a vast library of human experience that documented the ongoing effort to maintain justice and safety in a complex and sometimes chaotic world. Each report represented not just a single incident, but a contribution to the larger project of understanding how communities worked and how they could be helped to work better. Detective Santos locked his desk and prepared to leave for the day, but his reports would remain, adding their voices to the great conversation between past and future that took place in the careful language of police documentation, where every detail mattered and every word carried the weight of its responsibility to truth, justice, and the communities that depended on both. The sub-basement of the Central Records Division stretched further into the earth than most people realized, its corridors lined with filing cabinets that housed the oldest cases in the department's history. Detective Rachel Morrison had been assigned to the cold case unit for 3 years now, long enough to develop an intimate familiarity with these forgotten passages where decades of unsolved mysteries rested in careful, alphabetical order, waiting for new eyes or new technology to breathe life into their dormant investigations. The air down here carried a particular quality, thick with the accumulated weight of time and the faint mustiness of aging paper. Each cabinet held its own ecosystem of preserved documents, photographs that had faded to sepia tones, and evidence bags whose contents had taken on the patina of decades. The fluorescent lights hummed with a different frequency in this deepest level, as if even electricity moved more slowly through the accumulated layers of history. Cabinet 2-3 Azam contained cases from 1962 through 1965, an era when the city had been smaller, when neighborhoods had clearer boundaries, and when police work had operated according to different rhythms and expectations. Detective Morrison pulled open the heavy drawer, feeling the familiar resistance of metal aged by decades of expansion and contraction, the slight screech of hinges that had long since lost their lubrication, but had found their own accommodation with gravity and time. The files inside were arranged with the meticulous care that had characterized record-keeping in that era, each folder labeled in the careful block letters that secretaries had been trained to produce with mechanical precision. The paper itself told stories about the passage of time, some documents still crisp and white, others yellowed to the color of autumn leaves, all of them bearing the particular texture that came from decades of careful handling and preservation. She selected a file marked Williams, Jonathan, missing person, 1963, and carried it to the small reading table that had been positioned beneath one of the few windows in this underground space. The window was set high in the wall at ground level outside, and through it she could see the feet of pedestrians passing on the sidewalk above, their movement creating brief shadows that danced across the pages as she opened the file. The case concerned a 42-year-old insurance salesman who had left his office on a Tuesday afternoon in March and had never returned home. The initial report, filed by his wife Margaret Williams, described the man of regular habits who had shown no signs of distress or unusual behavior in the days leading up to his disappearance. He had kissed her goodbye that morning, had mentioned that he planned to stop at the hardware store after work to pick up supplies for a weekend project, and had asked her to keep dinner warm because he expected to be home by 7-30. Detective Morrison found herself drawn into the careful documentation that characterized the investigation, conducted primarily by Detective Frank Murphy, whose careful handwriting filled page after page of follow-up reports. Detective Murphy had approached the case with the methodical patience that seemed to define police work of that era, conducting extensive interviews with everyone who had interacted with Jonathan Williams in the weeks before his disappearance. The insurance office where Williams worked was described in detail. A small agency located on the second floor of a brick building on Commerce Street, with 3 agents sharing a suite of rooms that included a reception area, 2 private offices, and a small kitchen where employees took their lunch breaks. Williams's desk had been found exactly as he had left it, with client files arranged in neat stacks and a half-finished letter to a prospective customer still rolled into his typewriter. His colleagues described him as reliable and methodical, someone who took pride in his work and maintained careful relationships with his clients. The agency's owner, Mr. Robert Henderson, told Detective Murphy that Williams had been his most dependable agent, someone who arrived early and stayed late, who remembered details about his clients, families, and who had built a reputation for honesty and thoroughness that had made him one of the company's top performers. Asterisk. The investigation had expanded to include detailed examination of Williams's financial records, conducted with the cooperation of his bank and with permission from his wife. Detective Murphy had found no evidence of unusual withdrawals, no hidden accounts, no indication that Williams had been preparing to leave his life behind voluntarily. His savings account contained exactly the amount that Margaret Williams expected, and his checking account showed the normal pattern of household expenses and routine purchases. The hardware store visit that Williams had mentioned to his wife became a focal point of the investigation. Detective Murphy had interviewed every employee at Morrison Hardware, the store that Williams frequented for his weekend projects. The owner, Mr. James Morrison, a different Morrison than the detective now reading the file, remembered Williams as a regular customer who typically visited on Saturday mornings and who always knew exactly what he needed for his various home improvement projects. But on the Tuesday of his disappearance, Williams had never arrived at the hardware store. Detective Murphy had traced his likely route from the insurance office, walking the 6 blocks himself and speaking with business owners and residents who might have seen Williams during his journey. This canvas had produced several sightings of a man matching Williams's description, but the trail seemed to end at the corner of Commerce and Main Streets, where the last witness remembered seeing him waiting for the traffic light to change. The physical evidence was sparse but carefully documented. Williams's car had been found in its usual spot in the office building's parking lot, locked and undisturbed, with his briefcase still on the back seat containing the normal collection of policy documents and business correspondence. His coat was hanging on the hook behind his office door, and his lunch, a ham sandwich that Margaret had prepared that morning, was still in the small refrigerator in the office kitchen. Detective Morrison found photographs tucked into the file, black and white images that captured Williams's office exactly as it had been found on the evening of his disappearance. The pictures showed a workspace organized with almost military precision, Every item in its designated place, no signs of struggle or hasty departure. There was something deeply poignant about these photographs, the way they preserved a moment of ordinary life interrupted. A Tuesday afternoon that had become permanently frozen in time. The investigation had continued for months, with Detective Murphy following every possible lead and exploring every conceivable explanation for Williams's disappearance. He had contacted police departments in neighboring cities, checked hospitals and morgues within a 100-mile radius, and interviewed distant relatives who might have had contact with Williams in the weeks before he vanished. Margaret Williams had been interviewed multiple times, and her grief seemed genuine and profound. She described a marriage of 18 years that had been happy and stable, marked by the ordinary rhythms of middle-class life in the early 1960s. They had no children, a fact that she mentioned with sadness but without bitterness. And they had filled their lives with church activities, Jonathan's work with the local Lions Club, and Margaret's involvement in the garden club and the hospital auxiliary. The file contained letters from Margaret Williams to Detective Murphy, written over the months and years following her husband's disappearance, each one asking whether there had been any new developments in the case. Her handwriting, initially firm and hopeful, gradually became more fragile as time passed without answers. She had moved to Florida to live with her sister in 1967, 4 years after Jonathan's disappearance, but had continued to write occasional letters asking whether the case remained open. Detective Morrison found the final letter from Margaret Williams particularly moving. Written in 1975, 12 years after her husband's disappearance, it thanked Detective Murphy for his efforts and informed him that she had decided to have Jonathan declared legally dead so that she could finally settle his affairs and move forward with what remained of her life. She mentioned that she had never remarried, had never stopped hoping that he might someday return with an explanation for his absence, but had finally accepted she needed to find peace with the uncertainty. The case file included newspaper clippings from the local paper, which had covered the disappearance with the careful attention that small city journalism brought to local mysteries. The headlines were restrained, reflecting the less sensational approach to crime coverage that had characterized that era. Local businessman missing. Police seek information in Williams' case. Search continues for missing insurance agent. Detective Murphy's final report, filed in 1976, provided a comprehensive summary of the investigation's findings and conclusions. He had explored every possible explanation for Williams's disappearance, from accidental death to voluntary departure to foul play, but had been unable to develop sufficient evidence to support any particular theory. The case remained officially open, but active investigation had been suspended due to the absence of new leads or evidence. Detective Morrison closed the Williams file and selected another, this one concerning a series of burglaries that had occurred in the West Side residential district during the summer of 1964. The investigating officer, Sergeant Patricia Kelly, had been one of the few female officers in the department at that time, and her reports reflected both the careful attention to detail that characterized all the documentation from this era and the particular perspective that she brought to understanding the impact of crime on the families affected. The burglaries had followed a consistent pattern, with the perpetrator targeting homes during weekday afternoons when parents were at work and children were at summer day camps or visiting relatives. Sergeant Kelly's reports described each incident with careful attention to the specific items taken and the methods used to gain entry, but they also included details about the emotional impact on the families. Involved. Mrs. Dorothy Hanson had returned from grocery shopping to find her front door standing open and several rooms in disarray. The burglar had taken jewelry from her bedroom dresser, cash from a kitchen drawer, and a small television from the living room, but had left behind more valuable items that would have been difficult to carry or easy to trace. Sergeant Kelly noted that Mrs. Hanson seemed most distressed by the violation of her personal space rather than by the monetary value of the items taken. The investigation had revealed a pattern of careful surveillance preceding each burglary. Neighbors had reported seeing a young man on a bicycle in the area during the days before several of the break-ins. Someone who appeared to be observing the routines of different households and noting when homes were left unoccupied. This information had led Sergeant Kelly to focus her investigation on teenagers in the area who had both the mobility and the knowledge of neighborhood routines that the crime seemed to require. The resolution had come through community cooperation rather than traditional detective work. Mrs. Catherine Murphy, whose house had been burglarized during the second week of July, had recognized the description of the bicycle-riding observer and had identified him as Tommy Richardson, a 15-year-old who lived several blocks away and who had been doing odd jobs for neighbors throughout the summer. Sergeant Kelly's reports described her careful approach to interviewing Tommy Richardson and his parents, recognizing that the situation required sensitivity due to his age and the potential impact of criminal charges on his future. The interview had revealed a troubled family situation, with Tommy's father recently unemployed and significant financial stress affecting the entire household. Tommy had confessed to all 6 burglaries, explaining that he had been taking items that he could sell to help his family meet their basic expenses. He had chosen to target homes during times when he knew they would be empty, because he wanted to avoid confronting anyone directly, and he had limited himself to items that he thought would not be missed immediately. The resolution of the case had involved coordination between Sergeant Kelly, the juvenile court system, and several community organizations. Rather than pursuing criminal charges, the authorities had worked with Tommy's family to address the underlying financial crisis while requiring Tommy to make restitution to all the victims. He had worked throughout the following school year to pay back the value of the stolen items, and the experience had apparently had the intended effect of steering him away from future criminal activity. Detective Morrison found follow-up reports indicating that Tommy Richardson had graduated from high school and had enlisted in the Army, where he had served with distinction and had eventually become a career military officer. Sergeant Kelly had maintained contact with the family for several years, documenting Tommy's progress as an example of how careful intervention could redirect a young person's life away from a criminal path. These old cases seemed to reflect a different approach to law enforcement, one that had more time for understanding the social context of criminal behavior and more flexibility in developing solutions that addressed underlying causes rather than simply punishing symptoms. Detective Morrison wondered whether this was simply nostalgia for a supposedly simpler time, or whether there had indeed been fundamental changes in how police work was conducted. She pulled another file, this one dealing with a more serious crime, a robbery that had occurred at Peterson's grocery store in November of 1965. The case had been investigated by Detective William Chun, who had approached it with the same methodical care that characterized all the police work documented in these archives. The robbery had taken place on a Thursday evening just before closing time, when Mr. Alan Peterson was preparing to lock up his small neighborhood grocery store. According to his statement, a young man wearing a dark coat and a baseball cap had entered the store, pulled out what appeared to be a handgun, and demanded that Peterson open the cash register and hand over all the money. Peterson, who was 67 years old and had operated the grocery store for more than 30 years, had complied with the robber's demands without resistance. The register had contained approximately $85 in cash and several checks from customers who had made purchases earlier in the day. The robber had taken the cash but had left the checks, suggesting either some knowledge of how financial transactions worked or a preference for immediately negotiable assets. Detective Chun's investigation had begun with extensive interviews with Mr. Peterson, who had provided detailed descriptions of the robber and the circumstances of the crime. Peterson described the young man as probably in his late teens or early 20s, approximately 6 feet tall, with dark hair visible beneath his baseball cap. The weapon had appeared to be a small revolver, though Peterson acknowledged that his focus had been on the robber's face rather than on the specific characteristics of the gun. The investigation had included careful examination of the crime scene, with Detective Chun photographing the store's layout and documenting the exact position where the robber had stood during the confrontation. The store's small size meant that Peterson and the robber had been standing only a few feet apart, allowing for detailed observation but also creating significant potential danger if the situation had escalated. Detective Chun had canvassed the neighborhood extensively, speaking with residents and business owners who might have seen someone matching the robber's description in the area before or after the crime. This canvass had produced several useful leads, including a report from Mrs. Helen Rodriguez, who lived in an apartment above the store and who had heard voices in the grocery just before it normally closed. Mrs. Rodriguez had looked out her window and had seen a young man leaving the store and walking quickly toward the bus stop at the corner of Peterson and Main Street. She described him as moving with obvious urgency, but not quite running, trying to avoid attention while clearly wanting to leave the area as quickly as possible. The bus stop became a focal point of the investigation, with Detective Chun interviewing the driver of the bus that would have arrived shortly after the robbery and checking with regular passengers who might have noticed someone unusual boarding that evening. This approach had led to identification of the robber as 19-year-old Michael Santos, who had been recognized by several passengers as someone who normally did not ride that particular bus route. The arrest had been made at Santos's home 3 days after the robbery, with Detective Chun and 2 other officers executing a search warrant that had produced the clothes worn during the crime and the small revolver used to threaten Peterson. Santos had confessed to the robbery, explaining that he needed money to help his girlfriend pay for medical care after she had been injured in a car accident. Detective Chun's reports documented the complex circumstances that had led to Santos's decision to commit the robbery. He had been working part-time at a local factory while attending night school to complete his high school education, but his girlfriend's medical bills had overwhelmed his limited income. He had no criminal record and had been described by his employer and teachers as reliable and hardworking. The case file included letters from Peterson himself, who had expressed sympathy for Santos's situation while still supporting prosecution of the crime. Peterson wrote that he understood the desperation that could drive a young man to make such a serious mistake, but that he also needed to consider the safety of his business and his customers. The resolution had involved a careful balance between accountability and compassion. Santos had pleaded guilty to armed robbery and had been sentenced to 3 years in prison, with the possibility of early release for good behavior. He had also been required to make restitution to Peterson for the stolen money and for the emotional trauma of the crime. Detective Chun's follow-up reports tracked Santos's progress through the criminal justice system and his eventual successful reintegration into the community. He had served 18 months of his sentence before being released on parole, had completed his high school education while in prison, and had found employment with a construction company upon his release. His girlfriend had recovered from her injuries, and they had eventually married and started a family. Peterson had continued to operate his grocery store for another 15 years, finally retiring in 1980 and selling the business to a younger family who had maintained its character as a neighborhood institution. Detective Chun noted in his final report that Peterson had occasionally mentioned Santos in conversations over the years, expressing hope that the young man had been able to build a productive life after his mistake. These cases from the 1960s seemed to reflect a criminal justice system that had more time and resources for understanding individual circumstances and developing appropriate responses. Detective Morrison wondered whether the increasing caseloads and administrative demands of modern police work had made such thoughtful approaches more difficult to sustain. She selected one more file before taking her lunch break. This one concerning a missing child case from 1963 that had been resolved successfully, but not without considerable anxiety for everyone involved. 8-year-old Susan Miller had disappeared from her backyard on a Saturday afternoon while playing with her younger brother, leading to an immediate and extensive search effort that had mobilized the entire police department and hundreds of community volunteers. Detective James Wilson had coordinated the search, which had begun within an hour of Susan's disappearance and had continued through the night and into the following day. The file contained detailed maps showing the search areas, assignments for different groups of volunteers, and careful documentation of every possible lead or sighting reported by concerned citizens. Susan had been found safe after 26 hours, discovered sleeping in the basement of an abandoned house 6 blocks from her home. She had been frightened and hungry but otherwise unharmed, explaining to investigators that she had been playing hide-and-seek and had gotten lost while trying to find her way home. The abandoned house had provided shelter when darkness fell, and she had been afraid to leave during the night. The resolution of the case had led to important changes in how the police department approached missing child investigations, with Detective Wilson developing protocols that became models for other agencies. The file included copies of the procedures he had written, detailing the importance of immediate response, systematic search coordination, and community engagement in cases involving missing children. Detective Morrison found herself deeply moved by the thoroughness and humanity that characterized all these old investigations. The officers who had conducted this work had clearly understood that their job involved more than simply enforcing laws or solving crimes. They had seen themselves as guardians of community safety and well-being, responsible for addressing not just the immediate symptoms of problems, but their underlying causes. As she returned the files to their proper places in the cabinet, Detective Morrison reflected on the lessons that could be learned from studying these archived cases. The approaches taken by officers like Detective Murphy, Sergeant Kelly, Detective Chun, and Detective Wilson demonstrated the value of patience, thoroughness, and community engagement in effective law enforcement. The dust motes continued their slow dance through the shafts of filtered light, carrying with them the accumulated wisdom of decades of careful police work. Each file cabinet in this underground archive contains similar stories, examples of officers who had understood that their work was ultimately about serving people rather than simply processing cases. The fluorescent lights hummed their steady rhythm, providing illumination for anyone who wanted to learn from the experiences documented in these forgotten corners of the building. The files waited patiently for the next researcher, the next detective who might find inspiration or guidance in the careful documentation of how earlier generations had approached the challenge of maintaining justice and safety in a complex and often unpredictable world. Detective Morrison climbed the stairs back to the main level of the building, but she carried with her the quiet wisdom contained in those archived cases. The understanding that effective police work had always depended on the patience to understand problems fully and the commitment to address them comprehensively. The city above continued its restless movement, but down in the archives, the lessons of the past waited to inform the decisions of the future. The old courthouse stood at the intersection of Justice Avenue and 2nd Street, its limestone facade weathered by decades of seasons, but still bearing the dignified weight of its architectural purpose. Detective Lieutenant Anna Reeves had walked these steps countless times over her 25-year career, but tonight, as she made her way through the building's quiet corridors for a late evening meeting with the district attorney, she found herself noticing details that usually escaped her. Attention during the busy daylight hours. The building had been constructed in 1924, and its designers had understood something about the psychological impact of spaces dedicated to justice. The ceilings rose 15 feet above the marble floors, creating an atmosphere of solemnity and importance that seemed to encourage honesty and careful consideration. The hallways were wide enough for small crowds to gather without feeling cramped. Recognizing that justice was often a community affair that required space for family members, witnesses, and concerned citizens, her footsteps echoed softly against the marble, each sound seeming to join the accumulated whispers of decades of legal proceedings. The building held memories of thousands of cases, from simple traffic violations to complex criminal trials, each one contributing to the ongoing conversation between law and society that took place within these walls. The district attorney's office was located on the 3rd floor, in a suite of rooms that overlooked the small park where attorneys often gathered with their clients for last-minute consultations before court hearings. Detective Reeves took the stairs rather than the elevator, appreciating the rhythm of her steps on the worn stone and the way the building's architecture created natural pauses for reflection at each landing. The meeting concerned a case that had been working its way through the court system for more than a year, a complex fraud investigation that had ultimately led to charges against 3 individuals who had been operating what prosecutors described as an elaborate scheme to bilk elderly residents out of their life savings. Detective Reeves had been the primary investigator on the case, and her testimony would be crucial to the prosecution's efforts to secure convictions. District Attorney Margaret Collins was waiting in her office, surrounded by the boxes of documents and evidence that characterized major white-collar crime prosecutions. The office itself was modest in size, but impressive in its careful organization, with law books arranged on shelves that reached to the ceiling and case files sorted into neat stacks that represented months of preparation for trial. The fraud case had begun almost 2 years earlier when Mrs. Dorothy Hendricks, an 83-year-old widow, had contacted police to report that she believed someone was stealing money from her bank account. The initial investigation had seemed straightforward, involving what appeared to be unauthorized withdrawals from an ATM located several miles from Mrs. Hendricks' home in a neighborhood where she never shopped or conducted business. Detective Reeves had approached the case with the methodical patience that characterized her work, beginning with detailed interviews with Mrs. Hendricks and careful examination of her banking records. What she had discovered was a pattern of financial manipulation that was far more sophisticated than simple ATM fraud, involving multiple perpetrators who had developed elaborate methods for gaining access to elderly people's financial information. Mrs. Hendricks had been contacted initially by someone claiming to represent her bank's security department, warning her that suspicious activity had been detected on her account and asking her to verify her personal information to prevent unauthorized access. The caller had been convincing enough that Mrs. Hendricks had provided her social security number, her mother's maiden name, and other details that had given the fraudsters access to her accounts. The investigation had revealed that Mrs. Hendricks was one of dozens of elderly residents who had been targeted by the same group, each one contacted with variations of the same story, and each one convinced to provide information that was then used to access their banking and investment accounts. The perpetrators had been careful to limit their withdrawals to amounts that were significant but not immediately obvious, often taking money over periods of several weeks to avoid triggering automatic fraud detection systems. Detective Reeves had worked with banking security departments throughout the region to identify the full scope of the scheme, eventually documenting more than 40 victims whose combined losses exceeded $200,000. The investigation had required extensive coordination with financial institutions, careful analysis of banking records, and patient interviews with victims who were often embarrassed about having been deceived. The courthouse had become a second home to Detective Reeves during the months of preparation for trial, as she worked with prosecutors to organize the massive amount of evidence that would be needed to prove the charges against the three defendants. The building's law library had provided space for reviewing financial documents, and the small conference rooms had hosted dozens of meetings with witnesses and expert testimony. The main courtroom where the trial would take place was located on the second floor, a space designed to accommodate complex proceedings while maintaining the dignity and formality that serious criminal trials required. Detective Reeves had testified in this courtroom many times over her career, but each appearance still felt significant. A formal recognition of the importance of the work that police officers did in gathering and presenting evidence. The courtroom's wooden benches could accommodate approximately 100 spectators, reflecting the understanding that criminal trials were public proceedings that served not only the immediate interests of justice, but also the broader community's need to understand how its laws were being enforced. The judge's bench was elevated above the rest of the courtroom, creating a physical representation of the law's authority while also providing clear sightlines to all participants in the proceedings. As Detective Reeves and District Attorney Collins reviewed the evidence and planned their presentation strategy, they were joined by Detective Mark Foster from the Financial Crimes Unit, who had assisted with the technical aspects of the investigation. The three law enforcement professionals worked through the evening, organizing documents and preparing witness testimony in the quiet building where the normal bustle of legal proceedings had given way to the focused concentration of trial preparation. The defendants in the case were scheduled to appear in court the following morning, transported from the county detention facility where they had been held since their arrests 6 months earlier. The detention facility was located 15 minutes from the courthouse, connected by a route that had been traveled by thousands of defendants over the decades as they made their way to face the consequences of their alleged crimes. Detective Reeves had visited the detention facility many times during the investigation, conducting interviews with the suspects and gathering additional evidence as the case developed. The facility was newer than the courthouse, built in the 1980s, when the county had recognized that its old jail was no longer adequate for the growing population and the increasing complexity of criminal cases. The cells where the fraud suspects were being held were designed for pretrial detention rather than long-term incarceration, with basic amenities and access to legal materials that allowed defendants to participate in their own defense. Detective Reeves had observed that the facility's atmosphere was businesslike rather than punitive, reflecting the legal principle that defendants were innocent until proven guilty and deserved to be treated with appropriate dignity. The investigation had also led Detective Reeves to visit the small office building where the defendants had operated their scheme, a nondescript suite of rooms that had been rented under false names and equipped with telephone systems and computer equipment used to contact potential victims. The building's other tenants had been unaware of the criminal activity taking place in their midst, describing the defendants as quiet professionals who kept regular hours and caused no disturbances. The office space itself had been carefully designed to support the fraud operation, with multiple phone lines that allowed the perpetrators to maintain different identities when contacting victims, and sophisticated computer systems that stored detailed information about potential targets. Detective Reeves had spent hours in this space, documenting the evidence and trying to understand how the defendants had organized their criminal enterprise. The search warrant execution at the office had been conducted with the assistance of computer crime specialists who understood how to preserve electronic evidence that would be needed for prosecution. The building's management had cooperated fully with the investigation, providing access to security footage and rental records that had helped establish the timeline of the defendants' activities. As the evening progressed and the trial preparation continued, Detective Reeves found herself thinking about the broader implications of cases like this one. The fraud scheme had targeted some of the community's most vulnerable residents, people whose trust and financial security had been violated by individuals who had exploited their good faith and their unfamiliarity with modern financial technology. The courthouse where they were working had seen thousands of similar cases over its decades of operation, each one representing a moment when the community's commitment to justice was tested and affirmed. The building itself seemed to embody the patient, methodical approach that effective law enforcement required, with its solid construction and careful attention to detail, reflecting the same values that characterized good police work. The law library where they had spread out their documents was lined with volumes of legal precedents and case law that represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about how societies could balance individual rights with collective security. Detective Reeves had often found inspiration in these books, understanding that her work was part of a larger tradition of public service that extended far beyond any individual case or investigation. The detention facility where the defendants were being held represented another aspect of the criminal justice system. The recognition that some people posed sufficient danger to community safety that they needed to be temporarily removed from society while their cases were resolved. Detective Reeves had seen many people pass through that facility over her career, some of them eventually convicted and sentenced to prison, others acquitted or given alternatives to incarceration. The small office building where the fraud had been operated would soon be returned to legitimate use, its rooms cleaned and rented to new tenants, who would conduct honest business in the same space that had once housed criminal enterprise. Detective Reeves found something hopeful in this cycle of renewal, the way that spaces could be reclaimed from criminal use and returned to productive purposes. The trial itself would take place over several days, with prosecutors presenting evidence and witnesses in a careful sequence, designed to tell the story of the fraud scheme in a way that jurors could understand and evaluate. Detective Reeves would be one of the key witnesses, her testimony providing the foundation for much of the prosecution's case. The jury selection process had taken place the previous week in the same courtroom where the trial would be conducted, with potential jurors questioned about their ability to fairly evaluate evidence and their understanding of the presumption of innocence that protected defendants in criminal proceedings. Detective Reeves had observed this process from the gallery, noting how seriously most citizens took their responsibility to participate in the administration of justice. The judge assigned to the case was the Honorable Robert Martinez, a veteran of the criminal court system who had presided over thousands of cases during his 15 years on the bench. Detective Reeves had testified before Judge Martinez many times and had always been impressed by his fairness, his attention to detail, and his commitment to ensuring that all parties received appropriate consideration under the law. The courtroom's witness stand where Detective Reeves would testify was positioned to allow clear communication between witnesses and jurors while also maintaining the formal atmosphere that criminal trials required. She had learned over her career that effective testimony involved not just presenting facts but helping jurors understand the significance of evidence and the reliability of the investigative methods used to gather it. As midnight approached and the trial preparation session concluded, Detective Reeves gathered her materials and prepared to leave the courthouse. The building would remain open throughout the night, with security personnel maintaining watch over the offices and courtrooms that would resume their busy schedules the following morning. Walking back through the quiet corridors, Detective Reeves reflected on the importance of the physical spaces where justice was administered. The courthouse, the detention facility, and even the nondescript office building where the crime had been committed, all played crucial roles in the complex process of maintaining social order and protecting community safety. The courthouse steps were empty as she made her way to the parking garage, But they would be busy again in a few hours as attorneys, witnesses, defendants, and family members gathered for another day of legal proceedings. Each person climbing those steps would be participating in the ongoing conversation between individual actions and community standards that was the essence of criminal justice. The detention facility where the defendants spent their nights was quiet now, with most inmates settled into the routines of institutional life while they awaited resolution of their cases. Detective Reeves knew that some of them would return to productive lives in the community, while others would be sentenced to longer periods of incarceration. But all of them were entitled to fair treatment and appropriate consideration of their individual circumstances. The city around these buildings continued its restless movement, but the structures themselves provided stability and continuity for the legal processes that protected everyone's rights and safety. Detective Reeves had spent her career working within these institutions, and she had developed a deep appreciation for their role in maintaining the delicate balance between individual freedom and collective security. The fraud trial would begin in just a few hours, but the buildings where it would take place had been preparing for decades, their architecture and procedures refined through years of experience with the challenges of administering justice fairly and effectively. Detective Reeves drove home through the quiet streets, confident that the system she served, while imperfect, represented humanity's best efforts to create order from chaos and justice from conflict. The courthouse would stand ready for whatever the trial might bring, its marble halls echoing with the accumulated wisdom of countless previous proceedings, its rooms prepared to host another chapter in the ongoing story of a community's commitment to protecting its most vulnerable members from those who would exploit their trust. The buildings themselves had become guardians of justice, silent witnesses to the patient work of maintaining civilization through careful attention to law, evidence, and the presumption that all people deserved to be treated with dignity and fairness. Detective Patricia Hernandez had been working the residential patrol division for 8 years when she first began to notice the patterns that connected individual crimes to larger stories about how families and neighborhoods shaped each other across generations. It was not the dramatic crimes that taught her these lessons, but the quiet incidents that brought her regularly to the same streets, the same houses, the same families whose lives intersected with law enforcement in ways both subtle and profound. The call that had brought her to Maple Avenue on this particular Tuesday afternoon seemed routine enough. A report of vandalism at the Chun family residence where someone had spray-painted graffiti on the garage door during the night Mrs. Susan Chun had discovered the damage when she went to retrieve her newspaper that morning. And she had called police not because the graffiti was particularly offensive or extensive, but because it represented a violation of the careful order she maintained in her small corner of the neighborhood. Detective Hernandez had been to the Chun house twice before, once for a burglary attempt that had been thwarted when Mrs. Chun's dog had barked loudly enough to wake the neighbors, and once for a domestic disturbance call that had turned out to be a misunderstanding about a teenage grandson practicing drums in the basement. Each visit had given her small insights into the family's dynamics and their place within the broader community of Maple Avenue the Chun family had lived in, their modest 2-story house for more than 30 years, arriving as young immigrants who had worked multiple jobs to afford the down payment, and who had gradually transformed the property into a reflection of their values and aspirations. Mrs. Chun maintained a garden that was admired throughout the neighborhood, not for its size but for the careful attention she gave to each plant in the way she had created beauty within the constraints of a small urban lot. The graffiti on the garage door was simple, just the word "Go" written in red spray paint, but its placement and timing suggested that it might be connected to other incidents that had been occurring throughout the neighborhood over the past several weeks. Detective Hernandez had been tracking a pattern of minor vandalism and petty theft that seemed to target houses occupied by immigrant families. Incidents that individually might have seemed random, but that collectively suggested a deliberate campaign of intimidation. Asterisk. As she documented the damage with photographs and measurements, Detective Hernandez found herself thinking about the careful work that Mrs. Chun put into maintaining her property and the way that the graffiti represented not just physical damage but a psychological assault on the family's sense of security and belonging. The house itself told stories about the Chun family's journey from newcomers to established residents, with additions and improvements that marked different stages of their American experience. The front porch had been enclosed several years earlier, creating a small sitting area where Mrs. Chun often spent summer evenings, visiting with neighbors and watching children play in the street. The enclosure was modest but well crafted, reflecting the practical skills that Mr. Chun had developed during his years working in construction while studying English in night classes. The porch represented the family's growing comfort with their place in the neighborhood and their desire to participate more fully in community life. Mrs. Chin's garden occupied most of the backyard, organized in neat rows that maximized the growing space while creating pathways for maintenance and harvesting. Detective Hernandez had noticed during previous visits that the garden served as an informal gathering place for neighborhood women who shared seeds, advice, and conversation in multiple languages. These informal networks, she had learned, were often more effective than formal community organizations in addressing neighborhood problems and building mutual support among residents. Garage, where the graffiti had appeared, also served multiple functions beyond simply housing the family car. Mr. Chun used part of the space as a workshop, where he repaired appliances and bicycles for neighbors, work that he performed without charge as a way of contributing to community welfare while also maintaining skills that he had learned in his native country. The workshop had become an informal gathering place for men in the neighborhood, a space where practical problems were solved and friendships were maintained across cultural and language barriers. Detective Hernandez had learned to look at houses not just as crime scenes or addresses, but as centers of family life that connected to larger networks of relationships and mutual support. The Chun house was typical of many in the neighborhood, modest in size but rich in the connections that linked residents to each other and to the broader community. Understanding these connections was essential for effective police work because crimes often reflected tensions or problems within these social networks. The investigation of the graffiti incident required Detective Hernandez to consider not just who might have written the word "go" on the garage door, but why someone would choose to target the Chen family and what message they might be trying to send to the broader community. She began by interviewing neighbors who might have seen or heard something during the night when the vandalism occurred. But she also used these conversations to gather information about recent tensions or conflicts that might have motivated the incident. Mrs. Angela Rodriguez, who lived directly across the street from the Chun house, had heard what sounded like footsteps in the alley around midnight, but had not looked out to see who might have been walking there. Mrs. Rodriguez had lived on Maple Avenue for more than 20 years and had watched the neighborhood change as new families moved in and longtime residents moved away or passed on. She described the Chuns as good neighbors who kept their property neat and who always offered help when others were in need. Mr. Robert Johnson, whose house adjoined the Chen property on the east side, had not heard anything unusual during the night, but mentioned that his teenage son had overheard comments at school about families who didn't belong in certain neighborhoods. Mr. Johnson, who was African American and had experienced his own challenges with discrimination when his family first moved to Maple Avenue 15 years earlier, recognized the significance of these comments and had been trying to help his son understand how to respond to prejudice without escalating conflicts. These conversations revealed the complex social dynamics that shaped daily life in the neighborhood, where residents from different backgrounds worked to create community, while also navigating tensions that reflected broader social divisions. Detective Hernandez understood that her role involved not just investigating individual crimes, but helping to maintain the delicate balance that allowed diverse families to live together peacefully. The investigation expanded to include examination of similar incidents that had occurred in other parts of the neighborhood over the past month. Mrs. Maria Santos, whose family had emigrated from El Salvador 12 years earlier, had reported that someone had scattered trash across her front yard and had left a note telling her family to go back where you came from. Mr. Ahmed Hassan, whose family had arrived from Somalia 5 years earlier, had found his car windows soaked with messages that used offensive language to describe immigrants and refugees. These incidents created a pattern that suggested organized harassment rather than random acts of vandalism. Detective Hernandez worked with community liaisons and neighborhood association leaders to develop strategies for addressing the underlying tensions while also pursuing criminal charges against whoever was responsible for the harassment campaign. The resolution began to emerge through the patient work of building trust with residents who had been reluctant to share information about what they had observed. Mrs. Patricia Wong, an elderly Chinese-American woman who had lived in the neighborhood since the 1960s, mentioned during a follow-up interview that she had noticed a particular car driving slowly through the area on several occasions, always during evening hours, when children were playing outside and families were visible in their yards. The car was described as a dark blue sedan with rust spots around the wheel wells, and Mrs. Wong had noticed it because the driver seemed to be observing houses rather than simply traveling through the neighborhood. She had not initially connected this observation to the vandalism incidents because the car had not stopped or because she had not seen anyone exit the vehicle. But Detective Hernandez recognized that surveillance often preceded harassment campaigns, working with patrol officers who increased their presence in the neighborhood during evening hours. Detective Hernandez was able to identify the vehicle and its driver, a 24-year-old man named Kevin Walsh, who lived several miles away and who had no apparent legitimate reason for repeatedly visiting the Maple Avenue area. When approached by officers, Walsh initially claimed that he was visiting friends in the neighborhood, but he was unable to provide specific addresses or names when questioned. Further, the investigation of Walsh revealed a young man who had been struggling with unemployment and who had been consuming online content that blamed immigrants and minorities for economic problems affecting working-class communities. His decision to target families on Maple Avenue appeared to be motivated by a combination of personal frustration and ideological beliefs that had been reinforced by social media groups that promoted hostility toward immigrants and refugees. Criminal charges against Walsh were straightforward, involving vandalism and intimidation, but Detective Hernandez also worked with community organizations to address the broader issues that had created the conditions for his harassment campaign. This work included educational programs about immigration and cultural diversity, expanded community policing initiatives, and support for residents who had been targeted by the harassment. The resolution of the case also involved collaboration with Walsh's family, who had been unaware of his activities and who were shocked to learn about his involvement in harassment campaigns. His parents agreed to participate in community service activities and educational programs as part of a restorative justice approach that aimed to address underlying causes rather than simply punishing symptoms. Mrs. Chun and her neighbors organized a community response that included a block party celebrating the cultural diversity of Maple Avenue and a neighborhood watch program that would provide ongoing protection against future harassment. Detective Hernandez attended the block party and was moved by the way that residents had transformed a negative incident into an opportunity for building stronger connections across cultural and ethnic lines. The Chun family garage, where the graffiti had appeared, was repainted with the help of volunteers from throughout the neighborhood, and Mrs. Chun used the occasion to install a small mural depicting plants and flowers from different parts of the world. The mural became a symbol of the neighborhood's commitment to pure inclusion and its recognition that diversity strengthened rather than threatened community life. Detective Hernandez found that cases like the Maple Avenue harassment campaign taught her as much about effective policing as they did about the community she served. Understanding the social networks that connected families and neighbors was essential for both preventing crimes and solving them when they occurred. The patient work of building relationships with residents created trust that made investigations more effective while also contributing to the broader goal of maintaining community safety. Follow-up visits that Detective Hernandez made to Maple Avenue over the following months revealed the lasting positive effects of the community's response to the harassment campaign. Property values in the area had remained stable. New families had moved into houses that became available, and residents had developed informal systems for mutual support that made the neighborhood more resilient against future problems. Mr. Chun's garage workshop became an even more important community resource, with residents from different backgrounds learning practical skills, while also building friendships that crossed cultural boundaries. Mrs. Chun's garden expanded to include plants that had been brought by neighbors from their countries of origin, creating a living demonstration of how different traditions could coexist and enrich each other. Detective Hernandez also observed changes in how children in the neighborhood related to each other, with the community response to the harassment campaign providing opportunities for young people to learn about tolerance and mutual respect in practical rather than abstract ways. The neighborhood's elementary school reported improved cooperation among students from different backgrounds and increased participation in multicultural activities and celebrations. These observations reinforced Detective Hernandez's understanding that effective police work involved much more than responding to individual incidents or making arrests. The most important part of her job involved helping communities maintain the social connections that prevented problems from developing and that provided resources for addressing challenges when they arose. The Chun family continued to live on Maple Avenue, but their experience with harassment and the community's response to it had deepened their involvement in neighborhood activities and their commitment to helping other immigrant families feel welcome and secure. Mrs. Chun became an informal liaison between police and residents who were sometimes reluctant to contact law enforcement directly, helping to bridge cultural gaps that could complicate community policing efforts. Detective Hernandez's regular patrol of the Maple Avenue area became an opportunity to maintain relationships with residents and to monitor ongoing social dynamics that could affect community safety. She learned to recognize the signs of emerging tensions before they escalated into criminal incidents, and she developed skills for facilitating communication between residents who might otherwise remain strangers to each other. The quiet work of maintaining these relationships and understanding these social networks required patience and consistency, but it proved far more effective than reactive approaches that waited for problems to develop before addressing them. Detective Hernandez found that residents were more willing to share information about suspicious activities when they understood that police were genuinely committed to protecting the community rather than simply enforcing laws. The case files that documented her work on Maple Avenue reflected this broader understanding of police work, including detailed observations about family dynamics, neighborhood networks, and community resources that could be mobilized to address problems. These files served as resources for other officers who might be assigned to the area and as examples of how community policing could be implemented effectively in diverse urban neighborhoods. As Detective Hernandez continued her patrol duties throughout the city, she carried with her the lessons learned from families like the Chuns and neighborhoods like Maple Avenue. The threads that connected individual crimes to broader social patterns were visible to officers who took the time to understand the communities they served. And the most effective law enforcement strategies involved strengthening these positive connections rather than simply responding to their breakdown. The work was quiet and often invisible to the broader public, but it formed the foundation of community safety and social cohesion that made more dramatic police interventions unnecessary. In the patient observation of family dynamics and neighborhood relationships, Detective Hernandez had found both the purpose of her professional service and the methods that made that service most effective in creating the kind of community where all families could thrive. Sergeant Michael Torres had been working the midnight shift at the Central Precinct for 12 years, long enough to understand that the hours between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. revealed a different side of police work than the daylight calls that filled most officers' experiences. The night brought its own rhythm, its own particular challenges, and its own quiet satisfactions that came from watching over a city as it settled into rest and prepared for another day of activity, and purposed out the station during night hours took on a contemplative quality that was impossible to achieve during the busy daytime shifts. The main desk was staffed by Officer Jennifer Walsh, whose calm voice had guided countless late-night callers through crises both real and imagined. The dispatch center hummed with its own subdued energy, coordinating responses to the scattered incidents that required police attention. During the hours when most citizens were safely in their homes, Sergeant Torres began each night shift with a walk through the station, checking on the officers who would be working under his supervision and reviewing the reports that had been filed during the previous shift. This routine had become a meditation of sorts, a way of transitioning from his personal life to the professional responsibilities that would occupy the next 8 hours of careful attention to community safety. The holding cells were usually quiet at this hour, housing the few individuals who had been arrested during the evening and who would wait until morning for arraignment or release. Sergeant Torres made it a point to check on anyone being held, not because he suspected problems, but because he understood that being detained was stressful even under the best circumstances, and that small gestures of professional concern could make difficult situations slightly more bearable. Tonight the cells held 2 men, both arrested for public intoxication after separate incidents that had required police intervention. The first, a middle-aged construction worker named Robert Martinez, had been found sleeping on a park bench after apparently drinking too much while mourning the recent death of his brother. The arresting officers had noted in their report that Martinez had been cooperative and remorseful, and that he had expressed concern about missing work the following day. The second detainee was younger, a college student named David Kim, who had been arrested after campus security had called police about someone creating a disturbance outside the university library. Kim had explained to the arresting officers that he had been drinking to cope with stress about his upcoming final examinations, and that he had not intended to cause any problems for other students or staff. Neither situation represented serious criminal behavior, but both men needed a safe place to spend the night while they sobered up, and both would benefit from connections to resources that could help them address the underlying problems that had led to their arrests. Sergeant Torres made notes to follow up with both detainees in the morning, ensuring that Martinez received information about grief counseling services and that Kim was connected with the university's student assistance programs. The night shift's first call came at 12:47 a.m. A report of suspicious activity at Morrison's hardware store on 5th Street. Officer Patricia Chun responded to find that the store's burglar alarm had been triggered by a cat that had somehow gotten into the building and had knocked over a display of paint cans while exploring the aisles. The store manager arrived within 15 minutes to reset the alarm and to capture the cat, which appeared to be a well-fed neighborhood pet that had probably entered through an open loading dock door. This type of call was typical of night shift work, requiring officers to respond quickly to potential emergencies that often turned out to have simple explanations. Officer Chung's report documented the incident thoroughly, including her observation that the store's security system was functioning properly and that there were no signs of attempted burglary or other criminal activity. The cat was released unharmed into the alley behind the store, where it immediately began grooming itself as if the evening's adventure had been planned all along. The second call of the night came at 1:23 a.m. from Mrs. Dorothy Hendricks, an 84-year-old widow who lived alone in a small apartment on Oak Street. Mrs. Hendricks called to report that she could hear someone moving around in the apartment above hers and was concerned that her upstairs neighbor, Mr. Franklin, might be in some kind of distress. She explained that Mr. Franklin was usually asleep by 10 p.m. and that the sounds she was hearing were unusual for that time of night. Officer Mark Rodriguez responded to the call and discovered that Mr. Franklin, a 79-year-old retired teacher, had been suffering from insomnia and had been moving furniture around his apartment while trying to reorganize his living space. Mr. Franklin was embarrassed that his activities had disturbed his neighbor and apologized for causing concern. Mrs. Hendricks, when informed of the situation, invited Mr. Franklin to join her for tea and conversation when he found himself unable to sleep. Officer Rodriguez's report noted that both elderly residents seemed isolated and that their interaction suggested they might benefit from more regular social contact. He made a referral to the department's community outreach coordinator, who worked with local senior services organizations to identify residents who might need additional support or companionship. This type of follow-up represented the kind of preventive work that night shift officers often performed, addressing social problems before they became law enforcement emergencies. The quiet hours between 2 and 4 a.m. provided time for patrol officers to conduct routine checks of businesses and public areas, looking for signs of problems that might require attention and maintaining visible presence that reassured residents and deterred potential criminal activity. These patrols were conducted methodically, with officers covering assigned routes that ensured all areas of the city received regular attention throughout the night. Officer Susan Martinez drove her usual patrol route through the downtown business district, checking door locks and observing windows for signs of break-in attempts. The streets were nearly empty at this hour, with only occasional late-night workers heading home from restaurants and bars that stayed open past midnight. Officer Martinez had learned to recognize the normal patterns of late-night activity and could quickly identify situations that might require closer investigation. At 2:45 a.m., she noticed a light in the window of Goldstein's Delicatessen, a small restaurant that normally closed at 8 p.m. Investigating further, she found that the owner, Mr. Samuel Goldstein, was preparing food for a catering order that needed to be ready for pickup early that morning. Mr. Goldstein appreciated the officer's attention to his unusual presence in the building and mentioned that he felt safer knowing that police were paying attention to business activities during overnight hours. This interaction exemplified the relationship between night shift officers and business owners who worked unusual hours. The mutual recognition and communication that developed through these contacts created an informal network of observation and support that enhanced security for everyone involved. Officer Martinez made note of Mr. Goldstein's early morning work schedule so that future night shift officers would understand why his restaurant might show signs of activity during normally closed hours. Officer James Wilson patrolled the residential areas on the west side of the city, driving slowly through neighborhoods where families slept safely behind locked doors and porch lights provided gentle illumination for late arrivals coming home from work or social activities. These quiet streets represented the ultimate goal of police work, communities where people could rest peacefully without fear of crime or violence. At 3:15 a.m., Officer Wilson observed a teenager walking alone on Maple Street, several miles from the nearest bus stop and apparently without transportation home. When approached, the young man identified himself as 17-year-old Marcus Thompson, who had been visiting friends and had missed the last bus home. Officer Wilson offered to drive Marcus to his house, a service that was routine for night shift officers, who understood that stranded teenagers were vulnerable to various dangers. During the drive, Marcus mentioned that he had been having difficulties at home and had been staying with friends to avoid conflicts with his stepfather. Officer Wilson provided information about family counseling services and youth support programs, while also ensuring that Marcus arrived home safely. His report included recommendations for follow-up contact with the family to determine whether additional services might be helpful. The steady rhythm of night shift work continued with periodic calls that required police response but rarely involved serious criminal activity. A noise complaint at 3:47 a.m. turned out to involve college students playing music too loudly in an apartment near the university campus. The responding officer, Detective Sarah Kim, was able to resolve the situation through conversation with the students, who agreed to lower their music volume and to be more considerate of their neighbors' need for sleep. Report of a suspicious person at 4:12 a.m. involved a Keo, homeless man named Robert Chen, who had been sleeping in the doorway of a closed business on Commerce Street. Officer Martinez found that Chen was not causing any disturbance and had chosen the location because it provided shelter from the wind on a particularly cold night. Rather than making an arrest, Officer Martinez provided information about the overnight shelter that had space available and offered to drive Chun to the facility. These calls reflected the social service aspects of night shift police work, as officers encountered people who needed assistance with problems that were not necessarily criminal in nature, but that required compassionate professional intervention. The night hours brought officers into contact with residents who were experiencing various forms of distress or displacement. An effective response often involved connecting people with appropriate resources rather than enforcing laws. As dawn approached, Sergeant Torres found himself reflecting on the particular satisfactions of night shift work. While daytime policing often involved responding to active crimes and ongoing emergencies, night work was more often about maintaining the conditions that allowed communities to function peacefully. The preventive aspects of patrol work, the early intervention in potential problems, and the quiet assistance provided to residents in need created a foundation of safety and trust that supported all other police activities. The morning shift change at 7 a.m. involved careful briefing of incoming officers about any ongoing situations that might require follow-up during daytime hours. Sergeant Torres met with Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, who would supervise the day shift, to discuss the overnight arrests, the various service calls that had been handled, and any patterns or concerns that had emerged during the night hours. The two detainees from the previous evening were processed for release, with both men expressing gratitude for the respectful treatment they had received during their overnight stay. Robert Martinez was provided with information about grief counseling services and was assured that his employer would be contacted only if he requested such assistance. David Kim received materials about the university's student assistance programs and was encouraged to seek help with the academic stress that had contributed to his drinking. Night shift officers completed their paperwork before ending their shift, documenting the various calls they had handled and the services they had provided to residents throughout the city. These reports would become part of the permanent record of police activities and would be available for review by supervisors, prosecutors, and anyone else who needed to understand how law enforcement resources had been used during the overnight hours. Officer Patricia Chun finished her report about the hardware store incident, noting that the building's security system had functioned properly and that the store owner had taken steps to ensure that the loading dock door would be properly secured in the future. Her documentation would help future officers understand the layout and security features of the store, information that could be valuable if genuine security problems were to arise. Officer Mark Rodriguez completed his documentation of the call involving Mrs. Hendricks and Mr. Franklin, including his referral to community outreach services and his observation that both elderly residents might benefit from programs that provided social interaction and support. His report would be forwarded to the appropriate social services agencies, ensuring that follow-up contact would be made within a reasonable time period. The community outreach coordinator who received these referrals would contact both Mrs. Hendricks and Mr. Franklin during business hours, offering information about senior services programs and social activities that might address their apparent isolation. This type of follow-up represented the collaborative approach to community safety that recognized that police officers often identified social problems that required attention from other professional services. As Sergeant Torres prepared to leave the station at the end of his shift, he took a final walk through the facility, ensuring that all overnight activities had been properly completed and that the station was ready for another day of community service. The holding cells were empty, their occupants having been processed for release or transfer to other facilities. The dispatch center continued its 24-hour operation, but the pace had quickened as the city began to wake up and resume its daytime activities. The night shift had processed dozens of calls and interactions, most of them requiring patience, professional judgment, and genuine concern for community welfare rather than dramatic enforcement actions. The cumulative effect of these quiet interventions was a city that could trust itself to rest peacefully, knowing that dedicated professionals were maintaining watch over its safety and responding to whatever problems might arise during the vulnerable hours of darkness. The paperwork generated by the night shift would be filed carefully in the records division, where it would join the vast accumulation of documentation that chronicled the department's ongoing efforts to maintain community safety. Future researchers, supervisors, and officers would be able to review these records to understand how night shift work contributed to the broader goals of law enforcement and community service. Sergeant Torres drove home through streets that were beginning to show signs of morning activity, delivery trucks making their rounds and early commuters beginning their journeys to work. The city was waking up safely, protected by the quiet work that had been performed during the hours when most residents slept peacefully in their homes. The night shift had completed another cycle of vigilant care, maintaining the delicate balance that allowed communities to rest without fear and awake with confidence in their security and safety. The transition from night to day represented the continuous nature of police work, the understanding that community safety required constant attention and that different shifts brought different challenges and opportunities for service. The quiet rhythms of night work provided essential foundation for the more visible activities of daytime policing, creating conditions of trust and stability that supported all other law enforcement efforts. In the accumulated wisdom of thousands of such night shifts, the department had developed expertise in the particular challenges of overnight police work and had created systems and procedures that made effective use of the unique opportunities that night hours provided for preventive intervention and community service. The steady pulse of radio communications, the patient completion of reports, and the careful attention to residents in need created a framework of protection that operated continuously, ensuring that the Theaza community's trust in its safety was well-founded and consistently maintained. The evidence room stretched across the entire basement level of the old precinct building, its metal shelving units creating corridors lined with boxes, bags, and carefully labeled containers that held fragments of the city's criminal history. Detective Catherine Walsh had been assigned to the Evidence Management Unit for 6 years, long enough to understand that these stored items represented far more than simple proof for court proceedings. Each piece of evidence carried with it the weight of human experience, moments of crisis and resolution, that had been preserved in climate-controlled storage while the world moved on around them. The fluorescent lights cast their steady glow across rows of shelving that extended from floor to ceiling, each shelf holding its own collection of stories frozen in time. The air carried the faint chemical smell of preservation treatments and the musty odor of aging cardboard, creating an atmosphere that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time. Detective Walsh moved through these corridors with the careful attention of a librarian, understanding that her role was not just to catalog and maintain evidence, but to serve as guardian of these fragments of memory that might someday be called upon to reveal their secrets. The morning's first task involved processing a box of photographs that had been submitted as evidence in a burglary case from 1987. Images that had been stored for more than 30 years, while the case remained technically open despite the absence of viable leads. The photograph showed the interior of a small apartment where someone had carefully searched through personal belongings, taking items of value while leaving behind the everyday objects that had made the space a home. Detective Walsh spread the black and white photographs across her desk, studying them with the patience that such work required. Each image had been taken with careful attention to documenting the scene exactly as investigators had found it, but viewed decades later. The photographs also served as historical documents that captured details about how people lived during a different era. The furniture, the clothing, the books and magazines scattered on tables all spoke to daily routines and personal interests that had long since been disrupted by the intrusion of crime. The apartment belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Martinez, an elderly woman who had lived alone in the 3-room space for more than 20 years before the burglary had forced her to move in with relatives for safety and companionship. The photograph showed a life lived with careful attention to order and beauty, with handmade doilies protecting wooden surfaces and family photographs, arranged on shelves that also held small, decorative objects collected over decades of modest living. The burglar had been methodical in searching through Mrs. Martinez's possessions, opening drawers and closets with what appeared to be careful attention to avoiding unnecessary damage. The investigators who had processed the scene had noted this unusual consideration in their reports, suggesting that the perpetrator might have been familiar with the apartment or with Mrs. Martinez herself. This observation had led to interviews with neighbors, maintenance workers, and delivery personnel who had regular access to the building. But none of these investigations had produced sufficient evidence for arrests or charges. Detective Walsh found herself drawn to a particular photograph that showed Mrs. Martinez's bedroom dresser, where the burglar had apparently spent considerable time examining the contents of jewelry boxes and small containers that had held personal treasures. The photograph captured the careful way that items had been moved and examined, with valuable pieces removed, but costume jewelry left behind in neat arrangements that suggested respect for the owner's organizational system. The stolen items had included a gold wedding ring, a pearl necklace that had belonged to Mrs. Martinez's mother, and a small diamond brooch that had been a gift from her late husband. These pieces had monetary value, but their real significance lay in their connection to relationships and memories that could never be replaced. The police reports included detailed descriptions of each item, written with the understanding that recovery might be possible years after the initial theft. Among the evidence preserved from the Martinez burglary was a fingerprint card that had never been matched to any suspect in the department's files. The print had been lifted from a glass picture frame that the burglar had apparently picked up and examined, perhaps studying the family photograph it contained. Detective Walsh made note to have the print reprocessed using modern, computerized comparison systems that might be able to identify matches that had been impossible to detect with the manual methods available in 1987. The evidence storage system had evolved significantly during Detective Walsh's tenure, with computerized cataloging replacing the handwritten ledgers that had been used for decades. But the transition had created opportunities to review old evidence with fresh eyes and new technology, sometimes revealing connections or possibilities that had been missed during original investigations. This ongoing review process had led to the resolution of several cold cases, bringing closure to families who had waited years for answers about crimes that had affected their lives. Next box in Detective Walsh's morning queue contained evidence from a vandalism case that had been resolved successfully, but whose materials needed to be evaluated for permanent retention or disposal. The case involved damage to the Memorial Park monument, where someone had spray-painted graffiti that had required expensive restoration work to remove. The vandalism had been solved within weeks when the perpetrator, a teenager named Marcus Johnson, had confessed after being identified through surveillance footage. The evidence box contained the spray paint cans that Marcus had used, along with clothing that had been stained with paint during the vandalism incident. There were also photographs of the monument before and after the damage, showing both the artistic and historical significance of the memorial and the impact that thoughtless vandalism could have on community landmarks that held special meaning for residents. The case had been resolved through a restorative justice approach that required Marcus to perform community service at the park, while also learning about the history and significance of the memorial he had damaged. The evidence box contained letters that Marcus had written to the families of veterans commemorated by the monument, expressing his understanding of the harm he had caused and his commitment to making amends through positive community involvement. Detective Walsh found these letters particularly moving, as they documented the transformation that had occurred as Marcus learned about the sacrifices made by the veterans whose memory he had desecrated. The restorative justice process had connected him with veteran families who had helped him understand the meaning of military service and the importance of respecting memorials that honored those who had given their lives for their country. The successful resolution of Marcus's case had led to changes in how the police department approached vandalism incidents involving young people, with increased emphasis on education and community service rather than purely punitive measures. The evidence box contained documentation of these policy changes, along with follow-up reports showing that Marcus had completed high school and had enrolled in college courses while continuing his volunteer work at Memorial Park. As Detective Walsh processed the evidence review forms for the Memorial Park case, she reflected on how the passage of time changed the significance of criminal investigations. Cases that had seemed routine when they were initially processed often revealed deeper meanings when viewed years later, particularly when they involved young people whose lives had been redirected through thoughtful intervention by law enforcement and community organizations. The afternoon brought a different type of evidence review, involving materials from a series of break-ins at local businesses that had been solved through careful detective work and community cooperation. The case had involved 3 teenagers who had been systematically targeting small shops and restaurants during after-hours periods, taking cash from registers and food from kitchens to support themselves after running away from troubled family situations. The evidence boxes contained tools that had been used to force open doors and windows, along with items of food and clothing that the teenagers had accumulated during their weeks of living on the streets. Detective Walsh found herself thinking about the desperation that had driven these young people to crime, and the way that their arrest had actually provided access to services and support that had helped them address the underlying problems that had led to their criminal behavior. The lead detective on the case, Sergeant Robert Chun, had approached the investigation with understanding that the break-ins represented symptoms of larger social problems rather than simple criminal activity. His reports documented extensive efforts to understand the family situations that had led the teenagers to leave home, and his work with social services agencies to develop appropriate interventions that addressed root causes rather than just immediate behaviors. The evidence review revealed that all 3 teenagers had eventually returned to school and had been reconnected with family members or placed in supportive foster care situations. The businesses that had been targeted had participated in a restorative justice process that allowed the young people to make amends through work and community service rather than simply facing criminal penalties. Detective Walsh found photographs in the evidence boxes that showed the teenagers participating in cleanup and repair work at the businesses they had burglarized, working alongside the owners who had initially been their victims. These images captured the possibility of redemption and healing that could emerge from criminal justice processes that prioritized understanding and restoration over punishment and retribution. The systematic review of evidence from resolved cases formed an important part of Detective Walsh's responsibilities, ensuring that materials were retained for appropriate periods, while also identifying items that could be returned to their owners or disposed of according to established protocols. This work required careful attention to legal requirements and departmental policies, but it also provided opportunities to reflect on the broader patterns and lessons that emerged from the accumulation of criminal investigations. Some evidence needed to be preserved indefinitely, particularly in cases where appeals might be filed or where new investigation techniques might reveal previously undetected connections to other crimes. DNA evidence, in particular, was maintained in carefully controlled storage conditions that would preserve its integrity for decades. Recognizing that advances in analysis techniques could make old evidence valuable in ways that were not initially anticipated. Other evidence could be returned to victims or their families once legal proceedings were complete, providing closure and allowing personal items to resume their intended roles in family life, rather than remaining indefinitely in institutional storage. Detective Walsh took particular satisfaction in these returns, which often involved emotional reunions between people and possessions that had been separated by criminal acts. The late afternoon brought a visit from Mrs. Dorothy Santos, whose handbag had been stolen 5 years earlier in a purse snatching that had been solved when the perpetrator was arrested for a similar crime several weeks later. Mrs. Santos had come to retrieve personal items that had been recovered as evidence, including family photographs and small keepsakes that had sentimental value far beyond their monetary worth. Detective Walsh carefully inventoried the returned items with Mrs. Santos, ensuring that everything was accounted for and properly documented. The elderly woman was particularly grateful to recover a small prayer book that had belonged to her mother, a simple item that would have meant nothing to the thief, but that represented an irreplaceable connection to family history and religious faith. These interactions reminded Detective Walsh of the human dimension of evidence storage, the way that seemingly ordinary objects could carry profound personal significance for the people who owned them. The careful preservation of evidence served not only legal purposes but also the broader goal of maintaining the connections between people and their possessions that helped define their identities and relationships. As evening approached and Detective Walsh prepared to conclude her shift, she completed the paperwork for the day's evidence reviews and prepared materials for the next day's scheduled evaluations. The evidence room would remain secure overnight, protected by multiple layers of physical and electronic security that ensured the integrity of materials that might be needed months or years after their initial collection. The quiet atmosphere of the evidence room provided space for reflection on the accumulated weight of human experience that surrounded her daily work. Each box, each bag, each carefully labeled container held fragments of moments when ordinary life had been disrupted by crime, but also when communities had come together to restore order and seek justice for those who had been harmed. The photographs that filled so many evidence boxes captured scenes that had long since changed or disappeared entirely, preserving visual records of places and circumstances that existed now only in memory and official documentation. Detective Walsh understood that her work was part of a larger effort to maintain the connections between past and present that allowed communities to learn from their experiences and develop more effective approaches to preventing and addressing crime. The evidence room held thousands of such stories, each one representing the intersection of individual lives with the broader social systems that maintained order and safety. The careful preservation and management of this material evidence ensured that the lessons embedded in these stories would remain available to future investigators, researchers, and community members who might need to understand how previous generations had addressed similar challenges. As Detective Walsh locked the evidence room at the end of her shift, she carried with her the quiet satisfaction of having contributed to the preservation of memory and the maintenance of justice. The materials under her care would continue their patient wait, ready to reveal their secrets when called upon, serving as silent witnesses to the ongoing conversation between crime and consequence that shaped the moral fabric of community life. The building settled into its evening rhythm around the evidence room, but the stories contained in its carefully organized storage remained alive, waiting for the moment when they might once again become relevant to the pursuit of truth and justice. In their preservation, the past remained connected to the present, and the possibility of resolution continued to exist even for cases that seemed to have been forgotten by everyone, except those who maintained faithful watch over the fragments of evidence that held the potential for answers. Detective Captain Eleanor Martinez had been walking the same streets for 31 years, long enough to see how neighborhoods changed and evolved while carrying within them the accumulated weight of all the stories that had unfolded on their sidewalks and behind their windows. As she prepared for retirement at the end of the year, she found herself drawn to these familiar routes, not just as a police officer making rounds, but as someone who had become a living repository of the community's criminal history and its slow, steady progress toward greater safety and understanding. The morning walk took her down Elm Street, past the small grocery store that had once been robbed twice in a single month during the difficult winter of 1995. The robberies had been solved when the perpetrator, a young man struggling with addiction, had eventually sought help and had confessed to both crimes as part of his recovery process. The store owner, Mr. James Patterson, had participated in a restorative justice meeting where he had met the young man and had offered him employment once he completed treatment programs. That young man, David Chun, now managed the same store where he had once committed crimes, and his transformation had become a quiet inspiration to other business owners who faced decisions about how to respond when crime touched their establishments. Detective Martinez often stopped at the store during her patrol rounds, not because she suspected problems, but because the successful resolution of those old cases represented the kind of outcome that made her career in law enforcement meaningful. The next block brought her past the small park where a series of vandalism incidents in 2003 had led to the creation of an after-school program that had provided constructive activities for teenagers who might otherwise have found themselves in trouble. The vandalism had been relatively minor, involving graffiti on playground equipment and broken windows in the park's small recreation building. But Detective Martinez had recognized that the incidents reflected larger issues of youth engagement and community programming. Working with the Parks Department and local school officials, Detective Martinez had helped develop a response that addressed underlying causes rather than simply punishing symptoms. The after-school program had expanded over the years to include tutoring, sports activities, and job training programs that had served hundreds of young people and had measurably reduced juvenile crime rates in the surrounding neighborhoods. The park itself had been transformed in the years since those vandalism incidents, with new playground equipment and a community garden that was maintained by volunteers from throughout the area. Detective Martinez paused at the garden, noting how the neat rows of vegetables and flowers represented the kind of positive community engagement that emerged when residents felt ownership and pride in their shared spaces. Across the street stood the apartment building where Mrs. Rosa Gutierrez had lived when she became the victim of a complex fraud scheme in 2008. The scheme had involved telephone calls from someone claiming to represent her bank, asking for personal information that was then used to access her savings account and steal money she had been saving to help her daughter attend college. The investigation had revealed that Mrs. Gutierrez was one of more than 20 elderly residents who had been targeted by the same group of perpetrators, each one chosen because their names appeared on lists of Social Security recipients that had somehow been obtained illegally. Detective Martinez had worked with federal authorities to track down the perpetrators, but she had also coordinated with local social services to ensure that all the victims received assistance in dealing with both the financial and emotional impacts of the crime. As Mrs. Gutierrez had eventually recovered most of her stolen money through victim compensation programs and insurance coverage, and her daughter had been able to attend college with the help of scholarships that were awarded specifically to children of crime victims. The case had led to improved coordination between law enforcement and elder services agencies, creating protocols for identifying and assisting vulnerable residents who might be targets for similar schemes. The apartment building had been sold to a nonprofit organization that specialized in affordable housing for seniors, and the new management had implemented security measures and educational programs designed to protect residents from fraud and other crimes that commonly targeted elderly people. Detective Martinez maintained relationships with the building's management and made regular visits to provide safety presentations and to stay informed about any concerns that residents might have. Continuing her walk, Detective Martinez passed the corner where Officer Sarah Kim had been directing traffic during a major water main break in 2012 when she had observed behavior that led to the arrest of someone who had been burglarizing homes while residents were focused on the emergency situation. The arrest had prevented additional crimes and had demonstrated the value of maintaining police presence during community disruptions that could create opportunities for criminal activity. That intersection had since been redesigned with improved traffic signals and pedestrian safety features that had reduced both accidents and the need for regular police traffic direction. The infrastructure improvements had been funded partly through grants that were obtained based on the documented safety concerns that police officers like Officer Kim had identified through their daily observations of traffic patterns and community needs. Detective Martinez's route took her past Washington Elementary School, where a playground altercation in 2010 had escalated into a conflict between families that had required careful mediation to prevent further violence. The initial incident had involved children from different cultural backgrounds, and the parents' responses had reflected broader community tensions about immigration and cultural differences that had been simmering beneath the surface of apparently peaceful neighborhoods. Rather than treating the incident as a simple assault case, Detective Martinez had worked with school officials and community leaders to organize meetings where families could discuss their concerns and develop mutual understanding across cultural and linguistic barriers. These meetings had led to the creation of multicultural programming at the school and had improved communication between different ethnic communities in the surrounding neighborhoods. The school's current principal, Mrs. Maria Rodriguez, had been a teacher during the 2010 incident and had worked closely with Detective Martinez to implement conflict resolution programs that taught children how to address disagreements without violence and how to appreciate cultural differences as strengths rather than sources of division. The programs had been so successful that they had been adopted by other schools throughout the district. As Detective Martinez continued her walk through the neighborhoods that had shaped her career, she found herself thinking about the invisible networks of relationships and mutual support that had developed around the resolution of individual crimes. Each case had created opportunities for community members to work together in addressing problems, and the accumulated effect of these collaborations had strengthened the social fabric that made crime prevention possible. The small house on Maple Street, where elderly Mr. Robert Johnson had lived alone until a welfare check in 2014 revealed that he had been the victim of ongoing financial exploitation by a caregiver who had gradually assumed control of his finances and had been stealing from his accounts for more than 2 years. The investigation had been complex, involving coordination with adult protective services and financial institutions to document the scope of the theft and to ensure Mr. Johnson's future safety. The caregiver, a woman in her 40s who had been providing services to several elderly clients, had been using her access to personal information and financial records to systematically drain bank accounts and redirect Social Security payments. The scheme had been sophisticated enough to avoid detection for extended periods, but it had eventually been discovered when Mr. Johnson's nephew had become concerned about his uncle's apparent inability to pay for basic necessities. The case had resulted in criminal charges against the caregiver and the recovery of most of the stolen funds, but it had also led to improved oversight of home health care services and better protection for elderly residents who relied on outside assistance. Mr. Johnson had been able to remain in his own home with the help of legitimate care services that included safeguards against financial exploitation. House now belonged to a young family with small children, and Detective Martinez often saw them playing in the front yard where Mr. Johnson had once tended a small garden. The transition from one generation to the next represented the ongoing renewal that kept neighborhoods vital. But Detective Martinez also carried memories of the vulnerable elderly man who had needed protection from those who would exploit his trust and dependence. Her route brought her to the small business district on Commerce Street, where a series of break-ins during the summer of 2016 had been solved through community cooperation and improved coordination between business owners and law enforcement. The break-ins had followed a consistent pattern, with perpetrators targeting cash registers and small electronics during weekend hours when businesses were closed and the area was largely deserted. The investigation had revealed that the crimes were being committed by a group of teenagers who had developed detailed knowledge of business schedules and security systems through careful observation over several weeks. Rather than simply arresting the teenagers when they were caught, Detective Martinez had worked with business owners and juvenile court officials to develop a response that included restitution, community service, and educational programs about business operations and employment opportunities. The teenagers had been required to work with the same business owners they had burglarized, learning about the challenges of small business ownership and the impact that crime had on entrepreneurs who were trying to serve their communities. Several of the young people had eventually found legitimate employment with local businesses, and the area had not experienced similar break-in patterns since the original case was resolved. The business district had prospered in the years since those break-ins, with new restaurants and shops opening in previously vacant spaces and with increased foot traffic that provided natural surveillance against criminal activity. The business owners had organized themselves into a merchant association that worked closely with police to maintain security while also creating the kind of vibrant commercial environment that attracted customers and discouraged crime. Detective Martinez paused at the memorial bench that had been installed in Memorial Park to honor Officer James Wilson, who had been killed in a traffic accident while responding to an emergency call in 2017. Officer Wilson had been a young patrol officer who had shown exceptional promise in community policing, and his death had been a profound loss for both the department and the Tutsian neighborhoods he had served with dedication and compassion. The memorial bench faced the playground where Officer Wilson had often stopped during his patrol rounds to talk with children and parents, building the kinds of positive relationships between police and community members that made law enforcement more effective and more trusted. The bench had been funded through donations from residents throughout his patrol area, reflecting the impact he had made during his brief but meaningful career. Detective Martinez had mentored Officer Wilson during his early years with the department, and his approach to community policing had reflected many of the lessons she had learned during her own long career. His death had reminded everyone in the department that police work carried inherent dangers, but it had also reinforced their commitment to the kind of community engagement that he had practiced so effectively. The final stop on Detective Martinez's walking route was the small community center that had been built in 2018, with funding that had been secured partly through documentation of crime prevention programs that had been successful in the area. The center provided space for neighborhood meetings, youth programming, and senior services that addressed many of the social needs that could otherwise contribute to criminal activity. Detective Martinez had worked with community leaders and grant writers to document the effectiveness of various crime prevention initiatives, providing the evidence needed to secure funding for expanded programming. The community center had become a hub for positive activities that engaged residents of all ages and provided alternatives to the kind of idle time that could sometimes lead to problems for young people. As she completed her walk and returned to the police station, Detective Martinez reflected on the accumulated impact of 3 decades of community policing in these same neighborhoods. The streets looked much the same as they had when she began her career, but the social networks that connected residents to each other and to law enforcement had been strengthened through thousands of individual interactions and collaborative responses to problems. The crimes that had occurred in these neighborhoods over the years had created opportunities for residents and police to work together in addressing underlying causes and developing prevention strategies. Each resolved case had contributed to the broader understanding of how communities could protect themselves while also providing support for people who found themselves in difficult circumstances. Detective Martinez's retirement would mark the end of an era in community policing, but the relationships and programs that had been developed during her career would continue to serve residents long after she had left the department. The next generation of officers would build on the foundation she had helped create, adapting community policing strategies to address new challenges while maintaining the core principles of engagement and collaboration that had proven effective over decades of practice. The streets that had been her beat for more than 30 years would continue to evolve, with new families moving in and new businesses opening, while the underlying commitment to community, safety, and mutual support remained constant. Detective Martinez had been privileged to serve as both witness and participant in this ongoing process of neighborhood development, contributing her professional skills to the collective effort of maintaining the kind of community where families could thrive and businesses could prosper. As she prepared for retirement, Detective Martinez carried with her the satisfaction of having helped transform individual crimes into opportunities for community building and having contributed to the slow but steady progress toward greater safety and understanding in the neighborhoods she had served. The city had indeed become an archive of itself, holding in its streets and buildings the accumulated wisdom of all the efforts to create justice and maintain peace in the face of human complexity and occasional wrongdoing. The final archive room occupied the lowest level of the Central Records Division, 3 floors beneath the street where the oldest and most settled cases rested in permanent storage. Chief Records Administrator Margaret Chun had been the keeper of this vast collection for 18 years, long enough to understand that her role involved more than simple document preservation. She served as the guardian of the community's deepest memories, the custodian of stories that had moved through investigation and resolution into the peaceful silence of completed justice. The air in this deepest archive moved slowly, filtered and climate-controlled to preserve paper and photographs that might remain here for decades or centuries, outlasting the people whose lives they documented and the officers who had investigated their cases. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal song, casting steady illumination across row upon row of filing cabinets that contained more than 90 years of criminal investigations, each one representing a moment when disorder had been transformed into order, chaos into understanding. That Mrs. Xing walked these corridors with the reverence of a librarian in a cathedral, understanding that the silence here was not empty but full, heavy with the accumulated weight of human experience that had been carefully documented, thoroughly investigated, and finally laid to rest. Each file cabinet contained hundreds of cases that had been closed not just legally but emotionally, their participants having found whatever peace was possible and their lessons having been absorbed into the community's ongoing understanding of how to maintain safety and justice. The morning's work involved the ceremonial sealing of cases that had reached the end of their active retention periods, investigations that were now considered historically complete and ready for permanent archival storage. This process required careful attention to legal requirements and preservation protocols, but it also carried the deeper significance of formally acknowledging that these stories had reached their natural conclusion and could now rest undisturbed. First case in the morning's batch dated from 1934. A missing person investigation that had been resolved successfully when the subject was located living safely in another city under an assumed name. The case files told the story of a young woman who had fled an abusive marriage and had started a new life with the help of relatives who had protected her secret for more than 50 years. The investigation had been closed in 1987 when the woman, then in her 70s, had contacted police to confirm that she was safe and had never been the victim of foul play. Mrs. Chun handled the yellowed documents with the care they deserved, reading through reports that had been typed on manual typewriters by detectives who had long since retired or passed away. The investigation had been conducted with meticulous attention to detail, including interviews with dozens of potential witnesses and extensive searches that had covered 3 states. The dedication and thoroughness of the original investigators remained evident in every carefully preserved page. The case files included letters written by the woman's family members over the decades, asking for updates on the investigation and expressing their hope that she would someday be found safe. These letters created a poignant record of love and loss, hope and acceptance that spanned generations. The final resolution had brought peace to a family that had spent 53 years wondering about their missing daughter and sister. As Mrs. Chen prepared the 1934 case for permanent sealing, she reflected on how investigations from that era had been conducted with patience and persistence that seemed almost impossible in the modern world of instant communication and rapid case turnover. The detectives who had worked on this case had continued their efforts for decades, following up on every possible lead and maintaining contact with family members who never stopped hoping for answers. The permanent archive contained thousands of such cases, investigations that had been resolved through the steady application of professional skill and human compassion. Some had been solved quickly through fortunate breaks or obvious evidence, but many had required years of patient work that had tested the dedication and creativity of the officers involved. All of them had eventually found their way to resolution, contributing to the community's sense that justice was possible even when it seemed delayed or difficult to achieve. The next case in the sealing batch came from 1952, a burglary investigation that had been solved when the perpetrator had voluntarily returned stolen items and had confessed to the crime as part of a religious conversion experience. The case files documented not just the original investigation, but the remarkable story of redemption that had emerged when a young man had decided to make amends for his criminal behavior. The burglar, 19-year-old Thomas Morrison, had broken into several homes during the summer of 1952, taking jewelry, cash, and small valuable items that he had sold to support what he later described as a gambling addiction. The investigation had identified Morrison as a suspect, but before he could be arrested, he had appeared at the police station with a box containing all the stolen items he could locate, along with money to compensate victims for items he could not return. Detective Robert Wilson, who had handled the case, had been moved by Morrison's genuine remorse and his determination to accept responsibility for his actions. Rather than simply processing Morrison through the criminal justice system, Detective Wilson had worked with community leaders and the court system to develop a response that emphasized restoration and rehabilitation rather than punishment. Morrison had served a brief jail sentence, but had also been required to perform extensive community service and to meet personally with each of his victims to apologize for the harm he had caused. These meetings had been documented in the case files, creating a record of how genuine repentance could lead to forgiveness and healing for everyone involved in criminal situations. The follow-up reports showed that Morrison had become a successful businessman and community leader, dedicating much of his adult life to helping young people avoid the mistakes he had made. He had established a scholarship program for disadvantaged youth and had spoken regularly at schools and community centers about the importance of making ethical choices. His transformation had inspired similar programs throughout the region. Mrs. Cheung found Morrison's story particularly moving because it demonstrated how criminal justice could serve purposes beyond punishment, creating opportunities for growth and positive contribution that benefited both offenders and the communities they had harmed. The case files documented not just the resolution of a crime, but the emergence of a leader whose later contributions had far exceeded any damage he had caused during his brief period of criminal activity. The afternoon brought a different kind of closure as Mrs. Chun processed cases that had been resolved through more traditional law enforcement methods, but that had also contributed to important improvements in community safety and police procedures. A 1963 assault case had led to changes in how domestic violence calls were handled, ensuring that officers received better training in recognizing the complex dynamics that often characterized family conflicts. The case had involved a married couple whose arguments had escalated into physical violence, requiring multiple police interventions over several months. The investigating officers had initially treated each incident as a separate event, but Detective Patricia Kelly had recognized that the recurring problems reflected deeper issues that required comprehensive intervention rather than temporary crisis response. Detective Kelly had worked with social service agencies and family court officials to develop an approach that addressed the underlying causes of the violence while also ensuring immediate safety for all family members. The case had become a model for coordinated community response to domestic violence, influencing policies and procedures that were eventually adopted by law enforcement agencies throughout the state. The files documented the careful work that Detective Kelly had done to understand the complex factors that contributed to family violence, including economic stress, substance abuse, and intergenerational patterns of conflict that had never been addressed effectively. Her comprehensive approach had prevented future violence while also helping both spouses develop healthier ways of managing disagreements and stress. As evening approached, Mrs. Chun completed the day's sealing ceremonies and prepared the newly archived cases for their permanent rest in the deepest sections of the storage facility. Each sealed case would remain accessible if future researchers or legal proceedings required access to its contents. But the expectation was that these stories had reached their natural end points and would not need to be disturbed again. The process of permanent archival involved more than simply moving files to different storage locations. Each case was reviewed to ensure that all documentation was complete and properly preserved, that any personal effects or evidence had been handled according to legal requirements, and that appropriate notifications had been made to all relevant parties. This comprehensive review served as a final quality check while also providing an opportunity to reflect on the lessons and implications of each investigation. Mrs. Chun had observed patterns in the cases that passed through the archival process, noting how investigative techniques had evolved over the decades and how community responses to crime had become more sophisticated and comprehensive. The earliest cases often reflected simpler times when criminal behavior was addressed through direct punishment or informal community sanctions, while more recent cases showed increased understanding of the social and psychological factors that contributed to criminal activity. The archived cases also documented the evolution of police work itself, showing how officers had gradually developed more effective methods for investigating crimes, building community relationships, and collaborating with other agencies and organizations. The professional growth evident in these files reflected decades of learning and adaptation that had made law enforcement more effective and more responsive to community needs. As Mrs. Chun locked the archive facility at the end of her shift, she carried with her the quiet satisfaction of having contributed to the preservation of memory and the maintenance of institutional knowledge that would serve future generations of law enforcement professionals and community leaders. The cases that rested in permanent storage represented not just individual investigations, but collective wisdom about how communities could address crime and maintain justice. The deepest archive held more than documents and evidence. It contained the accumulated experience of countless officers, victims, witnesses, and community members who had participated in the ongoing effort to create order from chaos and understanding from confusion. Each sealed case represented a moment when that effort had succeeded, when justice had been achieved and peace had been restored. The silence that surrounded these archived stories was not the silence of ending, but the silence of completion, the peaceful rest that came when conflicts had been resolved and lessons had been learned. The files would remain here for decades or centuries, preserving the memory of how previous generations had addressed the challenges of maintaining community, safety, and social order. In the darkness of the locked archive, thousands of stories rested peacefully, their struggles resolved and their lessons preserved for anyone who might need to understand how justice could be achieved through patience, dedication, and genuine concern for all members of the community. The cases had been closed not just in legal terms, but in the deeper sense of having reached resolution that served both individual needs and collective good. The city above continued its restless movement, generating new stories and new challenges that would eventually find their way through investigation and resolution to join these archived memories in their peaceful rest. But the wisdom contained in these sealed files would remain available, ready to inform and guide future efforts to maintain the delicate balance between individual freedom and community safety that made civilized life possible. Mrs. Chun drove home through streets that carried their own stories, their own memories of crimes resolved and justice achieved. The archive she guarded represented just one part of the vast accumulation of human experience that shaped daily life in ways both visible and invisible, obvious and subtle. In the patient preservation of these memories, the past remained connected to the present, and the possibility of learning from experience remained alive for future generations who would face their own challenges in maintaining the kind of community where all people could live with dignity and security. The final files had found their rest, sealed away in the gentle darkness where all completed stories eventually found their way, held safe in the understanding that their lessons would endure even as the details faded into the peaceful silence of history, well preserved and wisdom carefully maintained. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison had been assigned to the newly created Community Integration Unit for 6 months, a position that had emerged from the department's recognition that effective law enforcement required ongoing engagement with neighborhoods rather than simply reactive responses to criminal incidents. Her office was located on the ground floor of the central precinct, with large windows that looked out onto the street where she could observe the daily rhythms of community life that her unit was designed to support and protect. The morning light filtered through those windows as Lieutenant Morrison reviewed the reports that had accumulated overnight. Not incident reports or arrest records, but community assessment documents that tracked the social health of the neighborhoods her unit served. These reports measured things that traditional police statistics might miss: the number of children playing safely in parks, the frequency of positive interactions between residents and patrol officers, the success rates of intervention programs that addressed underlying causes of crime rather than simply punishing its symptoms. The Community Integration Unit represented a new approach to police work that had emerged from decades of experience documented in the archives that rested 3 floors below Lieutenant Morrison's office. Those archived cases had taught important lessons about the effectiveness of patient, relationship-based law enforcement that addressed community needs comprehensively rather than focusing solely on criminal behavior after it occurred. Lieutenant Morrison's first appointment of the day was with Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, a community organizer who had been working to address concerns about youth engagement in the Riverside District. Mrs. Rodriguez had contacted the police department not to report crimes but to request assistance in developing programs that would provide constructive alternatives for teenagers who might otherwise find themselves drawn toward problematic activities. The meeting took place in the community conference room that had been designed specifically for these kinds of collaborative conversations. The room was furnished more like a living room than a traditional police facility, with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle and walls decorated with artwork created by local students. The atmosphere encouraged open communication and joint problem solving, rather than the more formal interactions that characterized traditional law enforcement encounters. Mrs. Rodriguez brought with her a comprehensive analysis of the challenges facing young people in her neighborhood, including limited after-school programming, few employment opportunities for teenagers, and social pressures that could lead to involvement with gangs or drug activity. Her presentation reflected months of careful research and community engagement, demonstrating the kind of grassroots understanding that professional Law enforcement could support, but could never replace. Lieutenant Morrison listened with the attention that such community expertise deserved, understanding that her role was not to provide solutions, but to help connect community insights with institutional resources that could support locally developed initiatives. The police department's new approach emphasized collaboration and support rather than external intervention, recognizing that sustainable crime prevention emerged from strong communities rather than intensive law enforcement. The conversation revealed opportunities for partnership between the police department and existing community organizations, including mentorship programs that could connect young people with positive adult role models and job training initiatives that could provide pathways to economic stability. Lieutenant Morrison made notes about potential resources and contacts that might be helpful, while also learning about community strengths and assets that the police department could support rather than duplicate. These collaborative meetings had become a central part of Lieutenant Morrison's weekly schedule, creating ongoing opportunities for communication between law enforcement and community leaders who understood local conditions and needs better than any external agency could. The relationships developed through these meetings had proven far more effective than traditional approaches that waited for problems to manifest as criminal activity before addressing them. The afternoon brought a different type of community engagement as Lieutenant Morrison participated in a walking tour of the West Side neighborhood led by residents who wanted to show police officers the positive changes that had emerged from collaborative crime prevention efforts. The tour was organized by Mr. James Chun, a longtime resident who had been involved in community organizing since the 1990s, and who had seen his neighborhood transform from an area plagued by drug activity and property crime into a stable community where families felt safe and businesses could prosper. The tour began at the small park that had once been a gathering place for drug transactions but had been reclaimed through community effort and ongoing police support. The park now featured new playground equipment, a community garden maintained by local volunteers, and open areas where families gathered for picnics and children played safely under the watchful eyes of neighbors who had developed strong informal networks of mutual protection. Mr. Chun explained how the transformation had required years of patient work, combining increased police patrols with community organizing that had addressed the social conditions that had made drug activity attractive to some residents and tolerable to others. The success had emerged not from dramatic enforcement actions, but from steady relationship building that had created conditions where positive activities could flourish and negative behaviors became socially unacceptable. Walking tour continued past houses where community gardens had replaced vacant lots that had previously attracted illegal dumping and other problems. These gardens were maintained by residents from diverse cultural backgrounds who had found common ground in their shared interest in growing food and creating beauty in their neighborhood. The gardens had become informal gathering places where neighbors developed relationships that strengthened community cohesion and informal surveillance. Lieutenant Morrison observed how these physical improvements reflected deeper social changes that had made the neighborhood more resistant to criminal activity. The residents who participated in maintaining community assets had developed personal investments in protecting their shared spaces, creating natural networks of observation and intervention that complemented formal law enforcement efforts without replacing them. The tour included a visit to the small business district that had been revitalized through collaboration between merchants, residents, and police officers who had worked together to create conditions that supported legitimate economic activity while discouraging criminal behavior. The success was visible in the busy sidewalks, the well-maintained storefronts, and the friendly interactions between business owners and customers who felt comfortable spending time and money in the area. Mr. Chun introduced Lieutenant Morrison to several business owners who had been part of the revitalization effort, each one contributing their own perspective on how collaborative approaches to community safety had created conditions for economic prosperity. The business owners described feeling supported by both residents and police, creating the kind of multi-layered security that made crime both more difficult to commit and less attractive to potential perpetrators. These walking tours had become an important part of the community integration unit's work, providing opportunities for officers to observe and understand the positive changes that emerged from collaborative crime prevention while also maintaining relationships with community leaders who could provide early warning about emerging problems or tensions. The evening brought Lieutenant Morrison to a community meeting in the Memorial Park neighborhood, where residents were working together to address concerns about traffic safety that had implications for both pedestrian security and the overall attractiveness of the area for families with children. The meeting was held in the community center that had been built through collaboration between city, government, and neighborhood organizations, creating a space where residents could gather to address shared concerns. The traffic safety discussion reflected the kind of comprehensive approach to community well-being that had emerged from years of learning about the connections between physical conditions and social health. Residents understood that busy streets with inadequate crosswalks and poor lighting created conditions that discouraged walking and outdoor activities, potentially leading to social isolation and reduced informal surveillance that helped maintain security. Lieutenant Morrison participated in the discussion as a resource person rather than a decision maker, providing information about traffic enforcement capabilities and accident data while listening to residents describe their observations and concerns about pedestrian safety. The collaborative approach recognized that residents were the experts on daily conditions in their neighborhood, and that effective solutions needed to emerge from their insights and priorities. The community meeting also provided opportunities for residents to share information about positive developments in their neighborhood, including new families who had moved to the area, successful community events that had strengthened social connections, and informal networks of mutual support that had developed among neighbors. These positive reports were as important as problem identification in maintaining community morale and motivation for continued collaborative effort. Lieutenant Morrison found these community meetings energizing because they demonstrated how residents could work together effectively when provided with appropriate support and resources. The police department's role in these collaborations was important but limited, providing technical expertise and institutional resources while recognizing that sustainable community safety emerged from resident engagement and social cohesion rather than external enforcement. As Lieutenant Morrison concluded her day and prepared for the evening shift officers to continue the community engagement work, she reflected on how this new approach to policing represented both innovation and return to traditional values. The archived cases in the basement of the building documented decades of police work that had recognized the importance of community relationships. But the Community Integration Unit represented a more systematic and comprehensive approach to supporting the social conditions that made formal law enforcement less necessary. The reports she would file that evening would join the accumulated documentation of police work that emphasized prevention and collaboration over reactive enforcement, creating records that future officers and community leaders could study to understand effective approaches to maintaining public safety. These contemporary reports would eventually find their way to the same archives that preserved the wisdom of previous generations of law enforcement professionals. The community partnerships that Lieutenant Morrison helped facilitate would continue to evolve and develop, creating ever stronger networks of mutual support and informal social control that made neighborhoods safer and more attractive for law-abiding residents. The police department's investment in these relationships represented a long-term approach to crime prevention that recognized the fundamental importance of community engagement in maintaining social order. The evening patrol officers who took over community engagement responsibilities after Lieutenant Morrison's shift continued the work of relationship building and collaborative problem solving that had become central to modern police work. Their interactions with residents, business owners, and community leaders created ongoing opportunities for communication and cooperation that strengthened the social fabric of the neighborhoods they served. The archived cases that rested in the basement of the police building had documented decades of learning about effective law enforcement, and that accumulated wisdom now informed new approaches that emphasized community partnership and preventive intervention. The files that would eventually join those archives would document the continued evolution of police work toward approaches that served community needs more comprehensively and more effectively. Lieutenant Morrison drove home through neighborhoods where the lights in windows represented families who could sleep peacefully because of the collaborative work that created conditions of safety and mutual support. The community integration approach had demonstrated that effective law enforcement involved much more than responding to criminal incidents. It required ongoing attention to the social conditions that either supported or undermined community well-being. The work would continue tomorrow and in the days and years that followed, building on the foundation of community, relationships, and collaborative problem solving that had proven more effective than traditional approaches in creating the kind of neighborhoods where all residents could thrive. The patient work of community engagement would generate its own stories of success and learning, adding new chapters to the ongoing narrative of how communities and law enforcement could work together to maintain justice and safety. In the quiet satisfaction of another day's contribution to community well-being, Lieutenant Morrison carried forward the understanding that police work at its best was about serving people and supporting the social connections that made civilized life possible. The archived wisdom of previous generations would continue to inform these efforts, while new experiences would add to the accumulated knowledge that guided ongoing efforts to create communities where peace and justice could flourish together. The police training academy occupied a modern building on the outskirts of the city. Its classrooms and simulation facilities, designed to prepare new officers for the complex realities of contemporary law enforcement. Instructor Margaret Santos had been teaching at the academy for 8 years, long enough to understand that her most important responsibility was not simply conveying technical skills but helping young officers develop the professional judgment and community-focused perspective that would make them effective servants of public safety. The morning session in Classroom 3 was devoted to case study analysis, where recruits examined real investigations from the department's archives to understand how effective police work combined technical competence with human understanding. Today's lesson focused on a community policing case from the 1990s where patient relationship building had prevented a neighborhood dispute from escalating into violence while addressing underlying social tensions that could have caused ongoing problems. Officer candidate Maria Rodriguez raised her hand as Instructor Santos concluded her presentation of the case details. "Ma'am, I'm wondering how we can apply these same principles in neighborhoods that might not have the same level of community organization that existed in this case. What do we do when residents don't trust police enough to participate in collaborative problem solving?" The question reflected the kind of thoughtful engagement that Instructor Santos hoped to encourage among her students. Officer candidate Rodriguez had identified One of the central challenges facing modern law enforcement, how to build trust and cooperation in communities where historical experiences had created skepticism about police motives and effectiveness. That's exactly the right question to ask, Instructor Santos replied. And it connects directly to another case we'll be studying later this week, where officers had to spend months just establishing their credibility before any collaborative work was possible. Trust isn't something we can demand or expect automatically. It has to be earned through consistent, respectful behavior over extended periods of time. The discussion that followed involved the entire class in considering how officers could demonstrate their genuine commitment to community service in situations where residents had legitimate reasons to be skeptical about police intentions. The conversation drew on examples from archived cases where patient, respectful engagement had gradually overcome initial mistrust to create productive partnerships between law enforcement and community members. Officer candidate James Kim described his own observations from the neighborhood where he had grown up, noting how positive interactions with individual officers had gradually changed his family's perception of police work. "My parents came here as immigrants," he explained, "and they had experiences with police in their home country that made them very fearful. But there was one officer, Officer Chun, who took the time to learn about our community and to help with problems that weren't necessarily criminal matters. Over time, my parents came to see him as someone who genuinely cared about our well-being." These personal perspectives enriched the classroom discussions, helping recruits understand how their future work would be shaped by the accumulated history of police-community relations in the neighborhoods they would serve. Instructor Santos encouraged these exchanges because they helped young officers appreciate the complexity of community dynamics and the importance of approaching each interaction with awareness of how their behavior would affect both immediate situations and long-term relationships. The afternoon training session moved to the Academy's simulation facility, where recruits practiced responding to scenarios that required both technical skills and community engagement capabilities. Today's simulation involved a neighborhood dispute where two families were in conflict over property boundaries, a situation that could easily escalate into violence without appropriate intervention, but that also offered opportunities for constructive problem-solving if handled skillfully. Officer candidate Susan Martinez and Officer candidate David Wong were assigned to respond to the simulated call, while their classmates observed and prepared to discuss the approaches taken and alternatives that might have been effective. The simulation was designed to present multiple challenges simultaneously: immediate conflict management, evidence gathering, community mediation, and long-term prevention planning. As the simulation unfolded, officer candidates Martinez and Wong demonstrated the communication skills and collaborative approaches they had been learning in their coursework. Rather than simply taking statements and filing reports, they worked to understand the underlying concerns of both families and to identify resources that could address the property boundary question, while also improving ongoing relationships between neighbors. The debriefing discussion following the simulation allowed the entire class to analyze the approaches taken and to consider alternative strategies that might have been effective. Instructor Santos facilitated the discussion to ensure that recruits understood both the technical requirements of such calls and the broader community impact of how they were handled. "What did you observe about how Officers Martinez and Wong approached the conflict?" Instructor Santos asked the observing students. "What seemed to work well, and what might you have done differently?" Officer candidate Patricia Johnson raised her hand. "I noticed that they spent a lot of time just listening to both families before trying to offer any solutions. That seemed to help calm the situation and made both sides more willing to consider compromise. "That's a crucial observation," Instructor Santos replied. "Often our first instinct is to move quickly toward resolution, but taking time to understand all perspectives usually leads to better outcomes in the long run." "What else did you notice?" The discussion continued with recruits identifying various aspects of effective conflict resolution and community policing, drawing connections between the simulation experience and the archived cases they had been studying. These connections helped them understand how the principles they were learning had been developed through decades of police experience, and how those principles could be adapted to contemporary situations. The evening training session focused on report writing and documentation, skills that might seem mundane but that were essential for effective law enforcement. Instructor Santos used examples from archived cases to demonstrate how careful documentation served multiple purposes: preserving evidence for possible prosecution, creating records for future reference, and contributing to the institutional knowledge that informed departmental policies and training programs. "Every report you write becomes part of the permanent record," Instructor Santos explained to the assembled recruits. "Years from now, other officers might read your reports to understand how similar situations were handled, or researchers might study them to identify effective approaches to community problems. Your documentation is contributing to the accumulated wisdom that makes all of us more effective at serving our communities." The recruits worked through exercises that required them to document complex scenarios involving multiple witnesses, conflicting accounts, and various types of evidence. The training emphasized clarity, accuracy, and completeness while also teaching them to recognize how their written reports would be used by prosecutors, defense attorneys, supervisors, and future investigators who might need to understand exactly what had occurred and how it had been addressed. Officer candidate Jennifer Walsh asked about the relationship between report writing and community policing approaches. "If we're focusing on collaborative problem solving and prevention, how do our reports need to be different from traditional incident documentation?" "That's another excellent question," Instructor Santos replied. "Community policing requires documentation that captures not just what crime occurred and how it was investigated, but what underlying conditions contributed to the problem and what steps were taken to address those conditions. Your reports need to tell the whole story, not just the law enforcement part." This expanded approach to documentation reflected the evolution of police work toward more comprehensive community engagement. The archived cases that served as teaching examples showed how effective officers had learned to document not just criminal incidents but the social context that surrounded them and the collaborative responses that had been developed to prevent future problems. As the training day concluded, Instructor Santos assigned reading from archived case studies that the recruits would discuss in the following day's sessions. These cases had been selected to illustrate different aspects of community policing and collaborative problem solving, providing examples of how experienced officers had applied the principles the recruits were learning to real-world situations. The Academy Library contained copies of hundreds of archived cases that had been prepared specifically for training purposes, with personal information removed, but with all the essential details preserved to help new officers understand how effective police work was conducted. These cases represented decades of accumulated wisdom about community engagement, conflict resolution, and collaborative crime prevention. Recruits were encouraged to spend time in the library studying these archived cases independently, using them to develop their understanding of how theoretical principles translated into practical applications. The library also contained interviews with veteran officers who had been involved in significant community policing initiatives, providing personal perspectives on how collaborative approaches had evolved and what lessons had been learned through experience. Officer candidate Rodriguez approached Instructor Santos after class to discuss her interest in specializing in community engagement and crime prevention. "I've been reading some of the archived cases about neighborhood organizing and collaborative problem solving," she said. "What kind of career path would allow me to focus on that type of work?" Instructor Santos appreciated the students' interest in community-focused policing and spent several minutes discussing various specialized units and assignments that emphasize prevention and collaboration over traditional enforcement activities. "The department has been expanding its community integration efforts," she explained, "and there are increasing opportunities for officers who want to specialize in relationship building and collaborative problem solving." These conversations with individual recruits helped Instructor Santos understand how the new generation of officers was thinking about their future careers and what aspects of police work most inspired their commitment to public service. Many recruits were attracted to law enforcement precisely because they wanted to make positive contributions to community well-being, and the training program had evolved to support and develop that motivation. As Instructor Santos prepared for the evening shift and the arrival of the night class recruits, she reflected on how police training had changed during her years at the academy. The curriculum had become more comprehensive, incorporating social sciences and community development alongside traditional law enforcement skills. The archived cases used in training had also evolved to emphasize collaborative approaches and long-term problem solving, rather than focusing primarily on enforcement and arrest procedures. The night class recruits brought different perspectives to their training, often including older students who were changing careers and who brought experience from other fields that enriched classroom discussions. Many night class students worked full-time jobs during the day, including some who were already employed in related fields such as social services, education, or community organizing. The diverse backgrounds of police recruits created opportunities for learning that went beyond formal curriculum, as students shared insights from their various professional and personal experiences. Instructor Santos facilitated these exchanges to help all recruits understand how police work connected to other community institutions and how effective law enforcement required collaboration with various professionals and organizations. The training academy's mission had expanded beyond simply preparing officers for traditional police duties to include developing community leaders who understood their role as part of a broader network of professionals working to maintain social well-being. This expanded mission reflected lessons learned from decades of police experience and documented in the archived cases that served as the foundation for contemporary training approaches. As the evening training session began, Instructor Santos welcomed the night class recruits and introduced the case study they would be analyzing. A collaborative investigation from the early 2000s where police had worked with community organizations to address a pattern of youth crime that reflected underlying social and economic problems rather than simple criminal intent. The case demonstrated how effective police work often required patience, creativity, and willingness to work outside traditional law enforcement approaches when community problems demanded comprehensive responses. The investigation had resulted in not just arrests but in expanded youth programming and economic development initiatives that had addressed the conditions that had contributed to the criminal activity. This case shows how police work connects to larger community development efforts. Instructor Santos explained to the night class recruits, sometimes the most effective law enforcement involves helping communities address problems before they become criminal matters. The night class discussion that followed drew on the professional experiences that many of these older recruits brought to their police training. Social workers in the class contributed insights about family intervention strategies, while teachers discussed classroom management techniques that might be applicable to conflict resolution. Business professionals shared perspectives on economic development approaches that could provide legitimate opportunities for young people who might otherwise be attracted to illegal activities. These rich discussions helped all recruits understand how their future police work would be enhanced by knowledge and skills from various fields, and how effective community policing required ongoing learning and collaboration with professionals from many different backgrounds. The archived cases they studied provided examples of how experienced officers had successfully integrated various approaches to address complex community problems. As the training academy concluded its daily schedule and prepared for the night security shift, Instructor Santos completed her preparation for the following day's lessons, which would focus on crisis intervention and mental health response. The curriculum continued to evolve as the department learned more about effective approaches to situations that required both law enforcement skills and social service capabilities. The Academy's mission of preparing officers for comprehensive community service reflected the ongoing evolution of police work toward approaches that emphasize prevention, collaboration, and problem-solving over traditional enforcement methods. The archived cases that formed the foundation of this training would eventually be joined by new cases documenting the community policing successes of the officers currently in training. The cycle of learning, application, and documentation that characterized effective police training ensured that each generation of officers could build on the accumulated wisdom of their predecessors while adapting to new challenges and opportunities for community service. The quiet halls of the Academy held the promise of future police work that would continue to evolve in directions that served community needs more effectively and more comprehensively than traditional approaches had been able to achieve.